chose his life, and many others like him.
Hello, I'm John Pienaar with Drive on Times Radio, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Well, it turns out that being leader of the richest and most powerful nation on the planet isn't as easy as it's been cracked up to be. Who knew? Well, last night at a rally in Michigan to mark his 100th day in office, Donald Trump showed his old genius for turning the deepest hopes and the darkest fears and the simmering rage of his followers into something closer to blind worship. He gratuitously mocked and insulted his beaten opponent Joe Biden. He boasted of taking revenge on past opponents. When he claimed yet again that he'd been cheated of victory in the last election but won, he sounded as if he actually believed it, which by now maybe he does. And he told the crowd in the home of US motor manufacturing that his trade war on the world would deliver countless new jobs and a golden age of prosperity. And as for those pesky polls showing that trust in his economic competence was faltering, well, the polls were fake. But the polls are not fake, and nor is today's figure from the UK will be in recession. So just hours into his second 100 days, let's try to see what happens next as the irresistible force that is Donald Trump's the campaigner when it crashes into the immovable object of hard economic and political reality. And the defining question on today's drive, is Trump hooked on the same intoxicating faith that he's given his followers in his ability to change the weather, like a dealer in some powerful political narcotic, high on his own supply? Or will President Trump recognize the eternal difference between taking power and keeping it, and for better or maybe much worse, change America and the world permanently? Well, here in our pop-up studio just across from the White House, we're going to be hearing live from big names and powerful voices, the likes of Trump's former national security advisor and now his most ferocious critic, Ambassador John Bolton. And we're talking to the serving US Republican Congressman Barry Moore, who is from the deep red and deep south state of Alabama, and many more for you too. And back home in the UK, meanwhile, Keir Starmer has been getting a lesson of his own, or maybe it's a test, in balancing the dilemmas that go with winning and using power. The subject is net zero. His teacher is Tony Blair, who's saying that net zero is an ideal the country can't afford. I'm going to be talking live to the Cabinet Minister Heidi Alexander in the next hour. Now, as much as from anyone else, I really would love to hear from you today. Just imagine, if you can, that you're an advisor to President Trump just for a day. Imagine you got his attention for 5 seconds, which is hard to do by all accounts. What is the one piece of advice that you would give the president in a single sentence? And remember, keep it brief or Donald Trump will lose interest. Send me your thoughts in a text, 87222, start with the word Times, or a tweet to @TimesRadio. And we're streaming live on YouTube for you if you want to watch what's going on here in our studio, as well as listen in to our conversation, and I hope join in too. First though, let's say hello again to Katie Balls, the newly appointed, minted new Washington editor of The Times. Hello to you, Katie.
Thanks for having me back.
Hi. So look, last night in that Michigan rally and in a slew of interviews on American network TV, we had the president, didn't we, just in the last few hours, telling us everything is going swimmingly. Everything is the best as it could be in all possible Donald Trump worlds. Doesn't seem quite to be working out that way according to objective measures, like the latest growth figures, Katie.
Yes, and I think those growth figures are obviously uncomfortable for the Trump administration. You've already had Donald Trump responding to it on Sky, on his, Blue Sky Social and as True Social, talking about the sense of this is actually all to do with Joe Biden. It's so early on into my term that you can't really put this on me. But it does, of course, raise a question, which is, if this were to persist, you end up in recession territory. When Donald Trump unveiled these tariffs on what he called Liberation Day, the recession warnings came quite quickly. And we are also having a meeting of his cabinet today, and the thing that Donald Trump really wants to talk about is an investment in the US and talking about all this money coming in. That is going to be, I think, one of the big pieces on the agenda today in that meeting. But of course, if this keeps up and if there is this instability around tariffs, even if the long-term theory is bringing back manufacturing back to the US, the longer this turbulence goes on, the harder it is to blame it on, those who came before.
There are different ways of reading these figures, to be clear. Look, these are the first quarter figures for this year. The tariffs can't really have had a material impact on their own in slowing down the rate of economic growth, pure and simple. But confidence has been taking a very big knock. And yes, a lot of people have been buying stuff into America ahead of the tariff war. So that might have just helped things get better than they might have otherwise been. But you're right, with confidence wobbling the way that it is, there's been more worry about the next quarter's figures. And then we will be in the recession that is going to be difficult for Donald Trump to explain away.
Yes, and I think this is the other thing, which is, where are we on the various deals that Donald Trump, is suggesting that he can do?
He said there were 200.
He said 200 ready to go.
There's only 195 countries on Earth.
He's so successful, he can do multiple. This is Trump world. But no, I mean, and of course, when he was pressed on, where are these deals, there were no answers coming. But there was also an interesting interview with The Atlantic recently, this week, that came out, where he was saying, the difference between my first term and my second term. The first term, he was just, trying to survive and keep the job. The second, he said he's actually in charge of not just the country but the world, and that does seem to play to this idea that he thinks he's going to be holding court in the White House as various countries come in and effectively kiss the ring in a bid to get one of these deals that will help them on tariffs. Now, there is a world where some of that starts to come off and you see a softening, particularly if you do it in a strategic way, but so far it does feel a little bit messy, particularly, for example, when you have one day White House officials talking up an idea of a deal with China, between the US and China, and then a few hours later China saying, sorry, what's this about? And we're not inside on that, but it means I think it is very much in the air whether this is going to land in the way that Donald Trump wants it to.
Yeah, we're very strong on slogans and spin, a little bit thin when it comes to results you can see and feel. And meanwhile, on another front, look, we're talking about trade, about money here. Look, we're talking about lives when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And we're watching news today developing pretty much as we're speaking about the prediction of a minerals deal, this mineral extraction deal, multi-billion, even trillion-dollar deal between America and Ukraine to extract Ukrainian minerals. Would it be signed today? Earlier suggestions that it might be. Then the thing seems to have hit a miss. I'll tell you what, let's both of us talk to Jimmy Rushton, who's the foreign policy analyst, who's on the line now, I think live from Kyiv. Hello to you, Jimmy.
Hi, good afternoon.
Jimmy, welcome to the programme. Can you throw some light on this? Very basically, is there a deal? Is it ready to sign or not?
Well, it seems there is a deal. Both sides seem to be relatively happy. I think where we've run into a little bit of a stumbling block is the Ukrainians say we can't actually sign the critical part of this document because it has to be ratified by the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada. And the Americans are saying, well, no, you've got to sign it now. But both sides seem to be relatively happy. Some of the Ukrainian opposition MPs who've seen the draft agreement have been saying that they're happy with it, that it's much improved over the previous deal. So hopefully we will see it signed in the near future.
Right, because the previous drafts of the deal were described, as you know, Jimmy, as larcenous. They were described by ferocious critics as an example of gangsterism on the part of Washington. Ukraine this time seems to be a bit happier. But the object of the exercise, in so many ways for Ukraine, was to get a deal which contributed to the security of Ukraine in future against Russian attack. And the president has been, well, more than reluctant to give anything like a concrete guarantee on that front. Can you tell us, has there been any advance on that?
Not really. I think for the Ukrainians, it's more a case of doing something that will placate Trump, because they know that Trump will take this and he'll, wave it around to show how he's a great deal maker, right? And that he's getting something back for the money that he would say Joe Biden invested in Ukraine. And for the Ukrainians, they're not really giving that much away because realistically, any economic activity that's realized from this agreement would take place, a minimum 5 to 10 years, because mining investments and mining extraction operations are not things that can be brought online quickly, especially not during a war.
All right, Jimmy Rushton in Kyiv. Thank you so much for throwing that shaft of light in the darkness on this story. Katie Ball's, of course, still with me, Washington editor at the Times. It's moving on so many fronts. Donald Trump fighting on so many fronts, Casey, including with the judges. On the home front, he's in a fight with one particular judge about the deportation to that terrorist prison in El Salvador of a migrant who was living in Maryland. And the judge in that case, just to boil it right down, that judge, she wants to see evidence the government's doing what she told her to do and bring the guy back. And there's a deadline today.
There is a deadline today, so we're expecting that later today. And what's been interesting is in some of the 100 days media that Donald Trump has been doing, he appeared to admit that if he wanted to, he could bring this guy back.
Yeah.
Which had not been that clear before. In
was
some
a little
of
bit off message, wasn't he? With
that seemed to go off message, and I think potentially they'll be correct. There was also potentially a bit of a gaffe about what tattoos this guy had. Donald Trump, I think, was referencing a photo that had been photoshopped, but there's since been clarification. But I think that admission that if Donald Trump wanted to, he could do it, does raise questions about what responsibility the White House has. But it also fits into probably one of the political battles at the moment, which is the Republicans I've spoken to, and certainly the White House, they are, while there are some legal complexities, you could put it politely, it is a fight they're quite happy to have. Whereas the Democrats have lent into this. You had one Democrat politician flying out to meet the guy,
yes,
and then doing a tour of the studios. And I think that lots of Republicans see that as a misstep by the Democrats and think that this actually plays quite well to their base. Yeah,
that is interesting, Casey, actually, because the latest polls, they send a mixed message. On the one hand, he has got significant support, the president, for the policy of kicking out of the country illegal migrants who commit crimes in America. Most people say, yeah, we agree with that. And actually, when you think about it, not many people are going to disagree with that, you'd have thought. I mean, who wants to say, look, you come to this country, you're here illegally, commit crimes, fine. I mean, I'm not sure you're going to get a majority for that. But most people are equally unhappy with the immigration policy, which sounds like a contradiction. But that seems to mean people want this to be done according to due process, according to the system of justice that they've taken for granted.
Yeah, I think there is a sense of that. And also, are you in control of your own system? If you look as though the courts are controlling you or you're being dragged through these things, it can start to make the administration look as though they don't have a grasp of it, or, veering into incompetence. So I think there's a thing of, if you say you're going to do something, people expect you to do it, as opposed to have this, drag out for a very long time. But I think, obviously we're on the first 100 days, but the battle between the White House and the courts in many ways is going to be one of the big stories.
One of the many defining stories. In one of those interviews last night, the president was talking about judges getting in the way of the president doing its job. That is a real head-butting competition between two of the branches of government in the United States of America. Katie, stay with us. It's lovely to have you with us while we're here on our little trip to Washington, D.C., helping us understand what on earth is going on here. I think you're going to stay with us. And coming up in a moment, I'll have the latest for you and be talking to Donald Trump, the former national security advisor to President Trump. Not any kind of fan of Donald Trump. You'll find out later on if you didn't know already. And I will have the latest for you from the markets with our Times Business Desk colleague. Time now is 4:17. I'm John Pienaar with Times Radio Drive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. in association with NatWest Cushion, making workplace pensions and savings easy. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more. I am John Pienaar with Drive on Times Radio. We're coming to you live from here in Washington, D.C. Just a stone's throw, not that you throw stones at the White House, but a very short walk to the White House. We're in the excellent company of Casey Balls, the Times' new Washington editor. And we have now been joined by Dr. Harry Broadman here in our pop-up studio, the former U.S. Assistant Trade Representative and a Chief of Staff in the past of the President's Council of Economic Advisors under Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. It's quite a CV. Welcome to you, Harry.
Thank you, John.
Can we start with the latest news from the Department of Commerce? So the economy shrank by 0.3% in the first quarter of the year. And to be, I guess, clear and fair, you can't directly attribute that to a policy of trade war and tariffs, which is now just kicking in. But it will, won't it, enhance worries about the state of the economy in future in the next quarter?
Absolutely. I mean, it is a function of the trade war in the sense that people were expecting this, and so people were stocking up, right? And so that has a negative impact on GDP growth. But I think you're quite right. But the real test is what's going to be happening in the next quarter. And one of the problems with the buying up of supplies prior is you may not have as much purchasing ahead, right? So that will also have an effect on that number.
Okay. Now, when these questions are raised, and they're raised almost hourly now, certainly since we've been here and a long time before that, the president says it's all going to work out in the end. He's on the case when it comes to trade deals. He said the other day that he's on the case with 200 trade deals. And as I keep saying, I'm going to stop saying this because it's a little bit too easy. There are only 195 countries on the planet, but there's no sign of any of them having concluded a trade deal. The president, it seems, if he's going to act by modifying his policy in the light of economic pessimism, there's no sign of that happening.
I think you're quite right. I mean, I was as a former trade negotiator. I said, well, there's not 200 states with whom you can negotiate, but I do think the fact is that he's not able and or willing to show, well, I've done this agreement with such and such a country and this country is quite telling. Yeah. And I think it only feeds into the nervousness that businesses have, that consumers have, that workers have, and our trading partners have. Okay, so what is this guy actually doing?
Yeah. Maybe the worry from the point of those who want to see some sort of change in direction, a twitch in direction, an alteration, is President Trump shows no sign of accepting that his argument that every dollar spent on importing goods into America is a dollar ripped off from America. That's his fundamental belief. And Katie, there's no sign of that changing right now.
No, and you still have, a large, sizable group in Donald Trump's orbit who believe tariffs are the correct policy. I think lots of people will now say, it's the correct policy, is what we need to, level the playing field, America first. But you could finesse it around the edges and we wouldn't have done it quite like perhaps they did do it with some of the calculations around it. But I think when we're looking ahead to the deals on the table, I think there is a sense that to show momentum, to get a couple across the line, to at least make other countries feel as though they have to give more to get
something
there.
To cheer, something to boast
Exactly. About. And, we've heard that some countries, Japan's been talked up and others could be, near the front of the queue. I think that's what a lot of people are looking at, because there is unhappiness amongst some of Donald Trump's natural supporters about what is going on at the moment.
Yeah, Harry Boardman, I'm just looking at the president's latest tweet. I say latest tweets. I read this about 20 minutes ago. I don't know how many he may have posted in the last 20 minutes, but he says that the stock market is Biden's, not Trump's. He said companies are starting to move into the USA in record numbers. Is there any evidence for that?
I haven't seen it, and it also depends on what you mean by companies. It could be mom and pop stores. I'm not sure that it's major corporations. I mean, and producers, and not just service, organizations. No, I think his biggest problem is he's not well staffed to produce economically meaningful statistics to make his case. That's his first problem. And his probably second, but maybe even more important problem is the uncertainty that he is engendering. That's far more corrosive than the tariffs, or not tariffs. Yeah. It's that no one knows what is ahead on the road. Is the road straight? Is it curvy? Are we going to take a left turn, a right turn? Is there going to be a U-turn? And that in and of itself is quite problematic.
Yeah. I'm going to turn now to both of you to, I don't know, maybe the most critical element of this global trade war, and that is, of course, the president and the United States versus China. Now, it was his target from the start. His aim, I don't think there's any dispute about that, his aim was to tilt the balance of global trade so America had the sort of strength that China enjoys now in the tech market and so many others. Now, the president gave an interview. Let's have a quick listen back to this. President Trump talking to the US network ABC just last night. I think we can perhaps hear that now.
We still have 145% tariffs on China. Your Treasury Secretary said we basically have an embargo on China.
Look, you're trying to say something's going to happen, Terry.
No, okay, well,
nothing's going to happen.
You know business.
Terry,
I want to ask you.
I do know business.
Yes, so 145% tariffs on China, and that is basically an embargo.
They deserve it.
It'll raise prices on everything from electronics to clothing to building houses.
You don't know that. You don't know whether or not China's going to eat it.
That's mathematics.
China probably will eat those tariffs, but at 145, they basically can't do much business with the United States.
Well, the President, Harry Boardman and Casey Bowles, he seems pretty content with the state of this war, but it's in a state of absolute confusion, isn't it, Harry, at least as far as American direction of policy is concerned?
Confusion may be a polite word for chaos. And I think you just have to look at and speak to business people. I mean, listening to the president is one thing, regardless of who the president is. The question is, who are the people making the deals? Who are the people hiring workers? Who are the consumers purchasing? And how do they feel? And I think if you canvass this economic landscape, you would find that most people are very nervous, at least the people that I come in contact with. And I'm not even talking as a professional, just even walking in stores, talking with friends. Everyone is very nervous.
And I think another thing here is when you speak to some officials in government and so forth, there are still quite a few appointments that haven't been made yet. This is not a fully staffed Donald Trump government yet. And it does mean, to the point that we were just hearing, that you have a situation whereby it's not as though Donald Trump has the complete team ready to go. There's also a situation where lots of, Donald Trump's cabinet, who we know are meeting today, are still jockeying for position. Everyone's working out who is the closest, who has his ear, how to work him. And I think that just adds to that sense of confusion as to what might happen next, which, as we all know, is really what hurts business confidence going forward.
Yeah, I wonder Harry just trying to avoid appearing to be the angel of doom in this entire conversation. I mean, and look at some way that it might work out better than the deepest pessimists imagine. Donald Trump is looking for deals. He hasn't signed the deals that he says he's signed. The negotiations aren't at the stage that he would like everyone to believe that they are at, but he is looking for deals, and he's talking to countries that want deals. They will, in large numbers, Harry, won't they, be offering trade-offs, access to those markets in exchange for blunting the edge of American tariffs. And when that starts happening, well, it will have an effect of as I wait, just maybe making the prospect of inflation less than it might otherwise have been. It will certainly give the president more to talk about, and there will be some companies bringing their business back, because some have done that.
Well, it really depends on what is the nature of the deal. If the deal could be that we're going to have higher tariffs, that some countries say, okay, we'll do this for you, but you'll have to do this for us in the future.
Yes.
Okay, so what kind of ice cream are we ending up with? Vanilla, chocolate? Just coming to a deal with tariffs.
Yes.
is bereft of the context and the composition of the tariff. If the agreed to tariffs are extremely high,
yes,
that's not good news. Just because there's certainty, there's not a sign of relief. Oh, now we have a deal.
Yeah.
Let's look at the deal. That's the issue.
Yeah. I mean, I guess this is one of those questions that requires one to have some sort of a magical insight into the president's psyche. But I don't know how many people, if anybody can claim to have that. But he believes in himself. He has an invincible sense of the rightness of his arguments. Almost invincible, because he watches markets and he watches the opinion polls. And even though he will never concede, Katie, that he's done, that he kind of retreats. We've seen pauses introduced at short notice. We've seen tariffs reduced at short notice. Maybe that's a kind of disorganization and chaos, but it has had some effect. The markets aren't always entirely in a mess, and that we could get more of that.
Yeah, and we do know, as you say, that when it comes to big business, banks, there is a way where they can say, oh, no, you do need to calm things down a bit here. And also the polls, when Donald Trump takes angrily to his social media accounts and will say, this poll is garbage, I don't trust your pollster, as he's done recently, that also shows that he is bothered. And that does mean that there is going to be a point, if this keeps up, where he starts to worry about what it means for his long-term poll rating.
Quite. I mean, he's a president he's the master, a genius at winning an election in the United States. Now, maybe there's more to learn about running the United States. That doesn't mean it's going to be impossible to learn those lessons. And we could see, can't we, Harry? I know we're doing a bit of clairvoyance here. It is possible to conceive of changes in directions, a slight one here, a bigger one there, which stabilizes his presidency, which stabilizes his popularity and keeps him in the political game heading into the midterms. That is possible?
It is possible, I think, but unless his behavior changes, I think that's an unlikely scenario. I think one of the points that you've touched on, John, is how is he governing and who is he listening to? And it's very clear when you listen to the Treasury Secretary, the Commerce Secretary, the Council of Economic Advisors folks, they're all deferring to him.
Yeah.
And he's not surrounded, like most presidents are, by smart people who are willing to tell him or her, whoever the president may be, bad news as well as good news.
Yeah.
And they're intimidated of advising the president.
Yes.
That's a very bad sign. And I think businesses are not stupid. They understand that.
Yes. In the first term of Donald Trump's presidency, he had people around him who he didn't like contradicting him and telling him what he couldn't do, but they did tell him that. They all got sacked for it, but they were there doing that. Now there's none of them, and the person who's got to give Donald Trump advice that he doesn't want to hear is Donald Trump. The question is, when that happens, will Donald Trump listen to Donald Trump?
Well, I think there are different voices, and for example, Scott Bessent, we know, is probably one of the more moderate voices, if you're going to put it on the scale.
He changed the tariff policy briefly.
And, these stories of people being locked in cupboards or bathrooms so as to get the message across.
I haven't heard that one.
Oh, yeah, there's been some reports of what you do to get Donald Trump's ear, still a work in progress, compared to Nabarro and others who we know are more hardline on the issue. So I think there are still some voices of moderation around it. But to the point I was made earlier, it still feels to me as though the dust is settling on who is the most influential when it comes to Trump's orbit.
Fascinating stuff. It's a story in progress, a presidency in progress. Dr. Harry Bobbin, lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
And Katie, as always, let's talk again very soon, maybe in the space of a few minutes. It is now 4:31. I'll have the latest for the markets for you in just a minute with our colleague Robert Miller on the business desk. And I'm going to be talking before 5 to the Alabama congressman who is very supportive of Donald Trump indeed, and John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor at the White House, who is not. And I want to hear from you really more than anyone else. Give me your thoughts. Send me that WhatsApp, 0333 003 2353. That's a voice note. You can tell us what you think in your own voice. I'd love to hear from you as well as know what you're thinking. Or maybe a tweet to @Times Radio. And we're watching, and you can watch us on YouTube, on our YouTube Times Radio channel, so you can see what's going on as well as hearing and joining in the conversation. Now, though, a little bit late, 4:32, we've been so immersed in our conversation here on Drive. Let's get the news with Martin Williams. I'm John Pienaar here with Drive on Times Radio, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Now, we're going to hear in a moment from Ambassador John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor to President Trump. I won't say I'm entirely in the dark as to what the ambassador's view is going to be on the presidency. He's been pretty critical in the past, but I'm always interested to hear his views as events unfold, which they do and are happening very, very rapidly. I invited you a little earlier on just to imagine you are an advisor to President Trump. Just imagine that for a moment. And now imagine that you've got the president's ear for 5 seconds. I know it's a stretch, but imagine that. And now stretch it further and imagine the president's listening to you. And he might actually take your advice. What advice would you give the president now? You've only got 5 seconds. You lose his attention otherwise, but tell me in a sentence what advice you would love to give to the president if you were there in the Oval Office now. This is in from David. David says, one word of advice: resign. Okay, well, that's short and sweet from David. And here is another, Helen, who says, dear Mr. President, please binge watch The West Wing with no distractions. I think I know what Helen means by that. And here's one from Mark. I would say to Trump, you need to swing with grace. Your swing is far too jerky. Golf and a metaphor for life. And this is from Mike. Thanks for writing in, Mike. Mr. Trump, I suggest you should consider a phrase that would resonate with many of the folks you clearly want to help. I urge you to measure twice and cut once. A reminder to take the time to double-check measurements and ensure accuracy before taking irreversible decisions. That's from Mike. Tell me what you think. Send me a text, 87222. Start with the word Times. Share your thoughts. Now then, it's 4:38.
Times Radio Business News.
And welcome to our friend and colleague on the other side of the Atlantic, Robert Miller from the business desk of the Times. Hello to you, Robert.
Hello there, John.
Robert, what is new in the markets?
Just still hanging on to that positive territory. Up, it'll be under 10 points for the FTSE 100 at the close, and the FTSE 250 up about 20 points. That's about the 12th, even the 13th day of consecutive rises, small though they are. So I think we'll take those where they are. Funnily enough, trade tariffs very much in the air, on both sides of the Atlantic. Smith & Nephew and GSK, they topped the leaderboard on the FTSE 100. Both had better than expected quarterly results. I think more importantly, though, and this is every company these days, they said there is a limited impact from tariffs so far. So not a bad day for them, I'm afraid. Different going the other way. And Barclays, they had higher profit for the first quarter, up 19% to 2.7 billion, spurred on by their investment banking arm. You know, in times of market turmoil, that's when they really come up. 28% rise there for the investment banking arm. Shares down about 1%, and I suspect there's a slightly domestic factor in that mortgages, lower interest rate, lower consumer confidence. Also down Haleon, the consumer goods group, 2% fall in quarterly revenue, and the market didn't like that. House builders, they were all pretty much down today. I think there are fears of when will interest rates drop? Will there be a recession? So will the housing market be as buoyant? Despite the fact, actually, Terry Wimpey says it's not been a bad start to the spring. And the miners, well, they were all in the sea of red, really. Glencore has reported sharply lower production. It might pick up in its trading arm, but even so, Anglo-American, Antofagasta, they were all the worst. Just worth noting on the FTSE 250, another fall for Aston Martin Lagonda. It's limiting its sales, US sales, quite clearly, and they're also burning through cash. Get this, 120 million pounds of cash they burnt through in the first 3 months of the year. The good news is it was better than 190 million last year. And oil is down below 64, fears of global growth. Pounds eased a bit, 133.
And Robert, just briefly, there's been some comment on tariffs from the tech boss Mark Zuckerberg. Tell us more.
Yes, well, I mean, they're talking about this, and this is ahead, I should say. Mark Zuckerberg is due to be talking to the market again later. Meta Platforms reporting their earnings. Their shares down 7.5% this year. I mean, we saw yesterday with Amazon and Jeff Bezos, where they're going to, with these tariffs, where they're going to say how much it cost, and they backed down on that pretty quickly. They were quick to side with President Trump once he took office, but now they're caught between a rock and a hard place, you feel.
All right, Robert Miller, thank you.
Times Radio Business News.
Now, joined now in the studio by, as promised, Ambassador John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor to President Trump. Welcome to the studio.
Glad to be with you.
Thanks, and good to see you face to face. We usually talk from a long distance down the line. Can we just start with Ukraine and the reports that have been developing in the course of the day so far? There seems to be a Ukraine deal on mineral extraction on the table. It seems to be in a good place from the point of view of agreement. Still has to go through the Ukrainian parliament, which I guess is positive. That's better than having a shouting match about what it should look like and a deadlock. But it's not entirely clear at all what it might mean, if anything, for Ukrainian security and the provision of that security from the United States. Are you optimistic, Ambassador, at all?
Well, I don't think this deal will have much to do with the security of Ukraine. I think, as we've heard in reports, and that's all we haven't seen the text yet, that the idea that Ukraine would be required to pay for military assistance that has already been conveyed, yes, mostly during the Biden administration, is out, which I think is fair. I also think it's fair to say to Ukraine, okay, so we've helped you a great deal for free. We're not backing away from that, but going forward, we hope you can pay for a little bit more of this. We did this in World War II. We've done it in every war we fought in. And so some kind of agreement on how that would happen makes sense. We'll see what this deal actually provides. But the point that Trump made some months ago, that a working minerals deal will mean the U.S. is more invested in Ukraine's security, is wrong. Yeah. Economic interests, of course, are significant, but we've heard over and over again, the closer integrated economies are, the less likely there is to be a war. There's a famous book in the United Kingdom written 4 years before World War I broke out, saying Europe was so economically integrated you could never have a war. Well, so much for that idea. There's a lot between the stated intention to exploit mineral resources and actually getting them out of the ground. We'll see what actually comes of this.
Right. So Ambassador, in your view, putting it very crudely, President Zelensky of Ukraine is deluding himself when he imagines there will be any measure of security that comes along with America's investment in a big part of Ukrainian minerals. And the same from Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator, who has made exactly the same argument. You think that's just it's misguided at best?
I don't think it will amount to much, at least during the Trump administration. And as I say, these are long-term projects. When you build a mine, you're investing for the long term, and so the benefits from this deal are far off in the future.
Yeah. Look, meanwhile, President Zelensky of Ukraine, he tells us all that he has been talking to American officials about targeting sanctions against Russia. Do you believe that? President Trump has been so reluctant to take any such action. There's been an occasional burst of rhetoric on Air Force One, for example, saying that might be in his mind, but literally no action. How much faith do you have in that?
Well, not much that Trump will do anything further to harm Russia, run, after all, by his good friend, Vladimir Putin. I think that U.S. sanctions enforcement generally is not as effective as it should be. I think this is a long-running problem. I don't think the imposition, the monitoring, the enforcement of sanctions as a whole are done very well. So I don't doubt that there's additional economic pressure the U.S. and Europe, for that matter, could put on Putin, but I don't see Trump initiating it.
Yeah, or even taking part in it, because that would be a powerful instrument of pressure were he to deploy it, but there has been no such sign.
Well, it's a very uncertain time. Trump has indicated he may walk away from the ceasefire negotiations if something doesn't happen. What we don't know is whether he will walk away further from Ukraine and once again suspend the delivery of military assistance, intelligence, and other aid, which would be very, very damaging, obviously, to Ukraine.
Okay, I want to move our focus for a moment. We're going to cover a lot of ground in a very limited space of time, but that's what we end up doing on every occasion. The president tells us again and again that he wants no more foreign wars. He wants no more foreign military entanglements for America. He's looking for a deal with Iran on Iran's nuclear development. I know, Ambassador, you have wanted action against Iran for quite some time, and you've wanted that really quite strongly. The president looking for some sort of verifiable nuclear agreement, that would be worth having, wouldn't it, for the sake of avoiding a war and for the avoidance of Iran developing itself into a nuclear-armed power?
Well, it'd be a very good idea if you could get it. The Iranians have repeatedly insisted on terms that make that impossible, including the 2015 deal, which is itself inherently flawed, and besides which they've been violating it and conducting activities that obviously have consistently put them closer to a nuclear weapon. I think this is a question of the regime itself. It has shown no evidence whatever of making a strategic decision to give up its decades-long pursuit of nuclear weapons. And until you have that, what we saw with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya in late 2003 and early 2004, when he did make it very clear, because of the example of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, that he was giving up Libya's pursuit of nuclear weapons. Until you get that, really, these discussions work on the side of the proliferator. In Iran's case right now, they desperately need time to protect themselves. They've been pummeled by Israel, destroying their ballistic missile production program. Their terrorist surrogates, Hamas and Hezbollah, have been decimated. The Assad regime in Syria has fallen. It is to Iran's benefit at this point to talk and talk and talk and talk. And I think that's what they're trying to get Trump into.
Yeah. For you, then, bombing, put it again very, very simply, bombing is the only answer.
Well, there are two answers. The real answer, the real long-term answer, is regime change in Tehran. Until this regime of medieval religious fanatics supported by an ardent military is removed, Iran will remain the principal threat to peace and security in the Middle East. I think destroying their nuclear program could cause further dissatisfaction inside the country, where there's already enormous finger-pointing and recriminations over the losses they've suffered since the Hamas attack on Israel on October the 23rd, 2023. Destruction of the nuclear program, I think, could make that even worse. I think the regime is internally unstable and vulnerable, and I'd like nothing better for the world as a whole, but for the people of Iran in particular, to get a different government.
Right. I can only hope that our listeners will forgive me if they're feeling dizzy at the pace at which I'm dragging their attention around the world. But I want to bring it back to America now and talk about the Department of Defense and the new Secretary for Defense, Pete Hegseth. Now, we saw last night he gave interviews in which the president stood by Pete Hegseth, the rather embattled Secretary for Defense in the Trump administration. That's despite two scandals of classified military material being shared on a social media app. Now, again, I know, Ambassador, you're no great supporter of Pete Hegseth, but can it be said, perfectly objectively, that the president's loyalty to his personal appointee, the defense secretary, is causing material harm to the security of the United States?
Well, I don't think Hegseth is up to the job. I think that was clear even before he was confirmed. I think the various mistakes he's made have only underlined that. And we're at a very serious point where there's going to be a significant increase made by the president in our defense budget. Congress is going to take some persuading to do that because it also implies cuts in domestic spending, so we have a smaller budget deficit. He needs an effective Secretary of Defense who has the confidence of the uniformed military and the civilian personnel in the Defense Department. And somebody who's casual with American secrets is somebody I think causes real concern inside the department.
That's a concern and not your choice. In a nutshell, though, can you identify material harm?
Well, I think allies around the world, not just because of Hegseth, because of Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, and others, are very worried about security of information they may convey to the United States as part of, the Five Eyes relationship with the UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand is one example. But I think it's also a question of discipline within the ranks. If people who are subjected to considerable potential penalties, including imprisonment, if they don't follow the security regulations, see their boss at the very top get away scot-free, I do think that has a material effect, negative effect on morale.
I'm going to ask you finally, really very briefly, so forgive me, but the question I'm putting to our listeners now, I mean, imagine you're there in the Oval Office, the president's willing to listen to you. I doubt he would be very willing to listen to you. But
I wouldn't bank on it.
You've got 5 seconds of the president's time. In a word, what's your advice?
I'd say rescind all of the tariffs you've announced, all the tariffs you've intended to announce. Just give it up, go back. There are other ways to deal with problems like China.
All right. Ambassador John Bolton, pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me
on the program here in Washington, D.C. Now, coming up here in a short while, I'm going to be talking to the Transport Secretary, Heidi Alexander. There's a lot of politics back home to talk about. The former Prime Minister offering maybe not very welcome advice to the Prime Minister on the subject of net zero. And also the U.S. Congressman Barry Moore from Alabama is going to be giving us a rather contrasting view, I suspect, of the president than we've heard there from Ambassador Bolton. I'm John Pienaar on Times Radio Live, coming to you from Washington, D.C., and we're in association with NatWest Cushion, putting your employees in control of their financial future. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more. Now, we are now joined live on the line here in our studio in Washington, D.C. Times Radio Drive now welcomes Congressman Barry Moore, who is the representative for the 1st District of Alabama and a member of the House Judiciary Committee and the Agriculture Committee for Good Measure. Congressman, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Hey, thank you, John. I appreciate you having me on this morning.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. Congressman, can I ask you first of all, are you entirely happy with the president's first 100 days in office? I've seen this described, well, actually I've heard it described by Donald Trump quite a few times as the most successful start to a presidency in history. Would you go that far? Do you share that view?
Yeah, I think if you just look at the border crisis itself, I mean, March of this year compared to March of 24, crossings are down 95%. And, you know, he ran on securing the U.S. southern border, and I think in many ways that is just one measurement of the success that he's having. And I think, honestly, I've been pleased with his cabinet. I've been pleased with the secretaries that he's put in positions. I've met with Pam Bondi and a number of others. And I just think that President Trump is putting a team around himself and has put a team around himself that he can, he can work with, that he can trust. I think it's important in this environment in Washington, D.C. You got to be able to trust the people around you. I think that's one thing maybe, John, that he picked up on from his first administration is he needs to put people that are here to get the job done. And we've got to move pretty quick. We understand that.
Yeah, so I hear you. You give him maximum marks, 10 out of 10, on every possible measure, including the cabinet. I mentioned the cabinet, Congressman, because I'm looking at a news feed coming in live from the White House. There's the president and his cabinet sitting around him. On his left side, Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary. And you're perfectly happy with that appointment too, despite not just one but two leaks of secret military information on a social media app. Look, where I come from, look, I don't take sides in these things. I just report what I see. I can tell you, though, in my home, if a minister had done such a thing, they'd be out on their ear in seconds. You're entirely happy, though.
I think if I just talk to the soldiers and being a veteran myself, they are excited about Pete. And then they think he'll do a good job. He is one of them. And he's not a part of the establishment or the swamp, as we call it here in D.C. But also, I mean, if you go back historically, I mean, the 30,000 deleted emails the Secretary of State had, there are things when Milley withdrew from Afghanistan, nobody they were calling for their resignation. I think this is a leftist narrative that they're pushing, trying to undermine the cabinet, trying to undermine the establishment that President Trump, the people he's putting around him. And so, look, I talked to the people on the ground, the soldiers and the people in my district at Fort Novosel, and they're really excited. We don't need DEI in the military. The only box people need to be checking is the box that they're qualified to do the job. And I think Pete checks that box. And so, there's going to be criticisms. There always have been. Every time Trump seems to pick somebody, there's some kind of criticisms. But to me, you give it time and you look at the people in the field and their response, and they're pretty excited, John. I think in general, I give the president high marks on all his members.
Okay, and yet, Congressman, no presidency has had such a low approval rating after 100 days in office. Well, there was one exception, and that was Donald Trump in his first term.
Well, yeah, and I think that really hits to the point, doesn't it? It's because the narrative in the media is all negative. If you look at the reporting on Donald Trump's first 100 days, 96% of the stuff is negative. And so in general, if you poll the public, you may get the negatives. But when I talk to folks in the district, when I talk to people in this country, part of the 75 million that reelected him, and there was a lot of bumper stickers around going and say, I'm going to vote for the felon. Apparently, the American people didn't really care what the DOJ said or what they charged him with. They want a man who will lead and who really cares about America and puts America first. And they see him moving in that direction. And I don't always trust the polls because, those things can be kind of tainted. Depends on how you ask that question, John.
Okay. I mean, I hear what you're saying. I completely understand your point and recognize what you say when you say that the media, the mass media in America is just so polarized. People hear generally a perspective on an argument, usually the one that they happen to agree with. And then I see these opinion polls, which are not rigged. We're talking about some respectable pollsters here, which seem to tell me that swing voters, the independents in America, their support and faith in the president's economic handling seems to be falling off a cliff. That's a real thing.
Well, it's the real thing because there's the unknowns in so much of the media to me. And look, the media lost a lot of credibility, John. You'd have to agree with me that the media lost so much credibility on the Russian collusion, on all these narratives. And like I even in judiciary, we talked about when I was questioning the Attorney General Merrick Garland about how in the world could a man have a record fundraising 4 days after being charged with felonies. And normally in the political world, campaign over, but the American people are not believing what the media is selling. But when you start talking about the tariffs and they're going, oh, they're going to cut this, they're going to cut that, and DOGE and what they're doing, really, if you look at it, the stuff that they're doing, stuff that we promised in D.C. to do for 40 years. We're going to cut waste, fraud, and abuse. And then the media goes out, well, they're going to cut Medicaid, or they're going to cut these benefits. It's not really true. Most of the stuff that's being cut is not impacting my people directly. They see it as the waste and fraud and abuse that we promised to do away with, that DOGE is actually doing. And the tariffs, I mean, Trump ran for years. Pelosi did speeches on the floor. Chuck Schumer did speeches on the floor of the Senate saying, we've got to get fair trade deals. We've got to do a better job managing China. When Trump actually does it, the media loses their minds and tries to just fearmonger. And that's why the media itself is losing credibility. And I don't trust these polls. I just trust the people. And the people I talk to in the 1st Congressional District in Alabama say, Donald Trump is doing exactly what we elected him to do. Matter of fact, most of them want him to move faster and want us to be more effective in codifying what he is doing with his EOs, the executive orders. And so,
okay, look,
so John, I know we're in a bubble up here, brother. We're in a bubble. But in real America, most of the people out there appreciate what the president's doing.
Okay, well, look, let me just invite you, if I can, Congressman, to give some advice in the best possible faith from a supporter of the president when it comes to the tariff policy that you mentioned there. In your view, should the president stick to this trade war, this tariff war, and then see prices go up, see the economy slow down?
It's not a trade war, my friend. It's just renegotiations of deals that have been done for years. You go back to the Marshall Plan coming out of World War II, where we said, yeah, Japan and Germany, y'all can sell your cars over here, but we won't bother having any Fords in London or any, Chevrolets in Tokyo. Because we cut a deal almost 100 years ago that has negatively impacted the auto industry in America. And so, and honestly, I got golfers, shrimpers in the Gulf of America that love the idea of tariffs. I've got foresters who appreciate tariffs. And Trump used to go on Oprah Winfrey in the 1980s and 90s ago. He said, I don't want to run for president, but we're really cutting some bad deals. We need some business guys at the head of this thing. And look, he's doing what he said he was going to do, John. And if we're going to restore production back in America, we've got to bring those jobs back. And tariffs, when you see, it's not a trade war when people are coming over here lining up to have a meeting with the president to negotiate their tariffs on U.S.
Okay. Look, I mean, I, if we had more time, I could point out that there are countries across the Atlantic, across Europe, who are looking at being driven into a recession by this tariff policy. They do see it as a very aggressive act. War, a trade war, may be a rather emotive term, but I think many would say that's perfectly justified. I do have to, though, draw the line there, and I'm grateful to you, Congressman, for joining us on the programme this afternoon. Thank you. Much more coming up here on Times Radio Drive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
It is 5 o'clock. I'm John Pienaar with Times Radio Drive, coming to you from Washington. And here are the headlines. Ukraine's Prime Minister says Ukraine and the US could sign a mineral deal within the next 24 hours. But it's reported the agreement may have hit last-minute hurdles. And a former schoolhouse master and scout leader has been sentenced to 46 years in jail for the prolific sexual abuse of young boys. Now, coming up from us here in Washington, let's talk about that mineral deal. How is that going? Will it cross the line? I'll be talking also to a former advisor to President Zelensky, and we're going to be taking in more of what the first 100 days of Donald Trump has meant and what the second 100 might mean, which I guess is the big question now. Also talking to his spiritual advisor, Pastor Mark Burns, who has had, it seems, a bit of a change of heart when it comes to Ukraine. We'll hear about that. And from back home in our politics in the UK, the Transport Secretary Heidi Alexander is joining us live.
This is Times Radio.
And now the news with Martin Williams.
John, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Officials in Ukraine say a minerals deal with the US could be signed within 24 hours. An agreement had been planned when Presidents Trump and Zelensky clashed at the White House at the end of February. However, there are reports of last-minute hurdles. Jimmy Rushton is a foreign policy analyst based in Kyiv. He says there is a deal and both sides seem to be relatively happy.
Where we've run into a little bit of a stumbling block is the Ukrainians say we can't actually sign the critical part of this document because it has to be ratified by the Ukrainian parliament. And the Americans are saying, well, no, you've got to sign it now. But both sides seem to be relatively happy. Some of the Ukrainian opposition MPs who've seen the draft have been saying that they're happy with it, that it's much improved over the previous deal. So hopefully we will see it signed in the near future.
Donald Trump says Joe Biden is to blame for the US economy contracting for the first time since 2022. Official figures show gross domestic product dropped by 0.3% in the first 3 months of the year, down from growth of 2.4% in the previous quarter. The figures are worse than the expected 0.2% decrease. A former scout leader has been jailed for 46 years for carrying out nearly 100 sexual offences against young boys. 81-year-old Richard Burrows went on the run for 27 years using a fake name. He returned from Thailand last March when he ran out of money and was arrested. The police watchdog is pressing ahead with disciplinary proceedings against the officer who shot Chris Cabba, saying the case meets the threshold. Martin Blake was cleared of murdering the 24-year-old following a chase in Streatham Hill in South London. Former Met firearms officer Tony Long thinks that should be the end of it.
I just think to myself, surely somebody senior in the IOPC with a bit of reason goes, do we really want to go down this route? We've got a bloody nose from the trial. Do we really want to do this?
The government could be about to reject demands from NHS unions for a bigger pay rise than what's been recommended. The Times is reporting an agreement on a 3% increase, as suggested by an independent pay review, will no longer be approved. It's raised fears of strike action at the health service. Downing Street is defending the government's net zero policies after Sir Tony Blair attacked short-term strategies limiting fossil fuels as doomed to fail. John McTernan is a former advisor to Tony Blair. He says the former Prime Minister is making some good political points.
He's making headlines like he has throughout his career. Grievance is the energy source for populist movements. And he's saying, if you don't engage with people's feelings, the facts won't persuade them. So you need to take people on a journey, and he sets out policies which totally align with Ed Miliband's current policies and a politics in Tony Blair Forward, which is totally in alignment with what Ed Miliband's actually doing.
And the head of the union involved in the long-running bin workers' strike in Birmingham is to lead crucial talks. Unite's Sharon Graham will be in the city for discussions tomorrow involving the conciliation service ACAS. Refuse collectors began a full walkout on the 11th of March over pay and jobs. And for a roundup of the news on demand, subscribe to the Times News Briefing on any podcast platform.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker.
John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive with NatWest Cushion.
It is really good to have your company here on Times Radio Drive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. I'm John Pienaar. Now, we are, about half a day into the second 100 days of Donald Trump's presidency, and not even his sloganizing and spin at last night's rally of the faithful in Michigan, or the devotion bordering on sycophancy of senior colleagues at the cabinet meeting, which is taking place now as I speak. None of it can entirely drown out the rather nagging warning that is suddenly hanging in the air, that it's time to get real. Now, the latest economic numbers, they are published today, and they show the American economy shrunk by 0.3% over the year. That will only heighten fears about the president's trade war on the world, and it causing real harm. The polling numbers, not least among swing voters, they have tanked. And President Polk, he says the polls are fake, but they are not fake. The defining question today on Drive in Washington is Trump hooked on the same intoxicating faith that he's given his followers in his ability to change the weather, like a dealer in some powerful political narcotic high on his own supply? Or will President Trump recognize the eternal difference between taking power and keeping it, and for the better, or maybe the much worse, change America and the world permanently? In a moment, I'll get you right up to date with the latest in Trump world with the Times correspondent Alastair Dorber, and we will get a view on the situation from Ukraine on the minerals extraction deal, which is on the point of being agreed by all accounts, but which has to go to the Ukrainian parliament for its final thumbs up. And as much as anyone else, I really want to hear from you today. I do invite you again. Imagine for a moment you are an advisor to President Trump, that you are in the Oval Office, that you have got his attention for 5 seconds, which I think is not always easy to do, and that he's listening, which is maybe even harder. How do you use that 5 seconds in a line, in a sentence, while you've got his attention? What is your one piece of advice? Send it to us. Send me a text, 87222. Start with the word Times, or a tweet to @Times Radio. And we are now streaming on YouTube, on the Times Radio channel, so you can see us as well as hear us, and you join in the conversation as we go. As I say, great to have your company. Now, though, really great to have the company of Alastair Dorber back with us, the Washington correspondent for the Times. Hello to you, Alastair.
Afternoon, John.
So we can see on our news feed, Alastair, the cabinet meeting which is going on now. So apparently the president has been saying, look, the economic figures today, the slowdown in growth, it's gone into negative territory. He says that's about Joe Biden. And to be fair, there's only so much you can attribute to the tariff policy when it comes to this first quarter's growth figures. But the background is rather pessimistic, and there'll be nowhere left to run when we get the next quarter's numbers.
Exactly. In 3 months' time, when we get the next numbers, I think Donald Trump will try and blame Joe Biden and the previous administration if the numbers look bad. But don't forget, Trump has been saying during his first 100 days in office that there might well be some pain from the tariffs. He was asked in a Fox News interview 6-7 weeks ago, would there be a recession in the US in the last half of this year? And he refused to rule it out. He's softening, I think, the American public up for a downturn in their fortunes, but stresses that his tariff policy, his signature economic policy, if you like, is A, here to stay, and B, will work, and will make Americans vastly wealthier than they are already. The polls, as we've seen over the last couple of days, indicate that Americans are becoming increasingly sceptical about that.
Yeah, I mean, look, the tariff policy, the line is it's here to stay, but there's a big wide open question as to what it will look like at the end of all of these negotiations, and you're right, a lot of countries want to talk to the Trump administration. Why would you not, when you've just been zapped with a really damaging set of trade tariffs out of thin air? But what the policy looks like when all of that is said and done, my goodness, who knows?
Well, you mentioned about that having 5 seconds with Trump in the Oval Office. seems that when some of his advisors are in with him, those that are sceptical, perhaps, or a bit more sceptical about the tariff policy, they're able to sway his opinion a little bit. We've had 90-day pauses. We've had exceptions to the auto tariffs that are due to come in, where car manufacturers aren't going to have to pay a tariff every time a car part crosses the American border. So there are people close to him who are able, I think, as they see it, to smooth off some of the edges. But you're right. The policy's here to stay, and I think that the Americans are bracing. They've seen the Dow Jones down another 700 points this morning when I last looked. They're seeing that their wealth is being eroded. Donald Trump says it's a short-term problem. We'll get through it, and the pain now is it will be worth it come this time next year or later in this year, whenever. But the polls suggest that people are getting increasingly wary and sceptical.
Yeah, that's the mood out there. Still a lot of loyalty among Donald Trump's loyal supporters, but some of the swing voters, they seem to be shifting quite significantly. And they're not going to the Democrats. That's also worth noting. Yeah. Some of those people who've lost faith or losing it in Trump, they're not going over to the Democrats. The Democrats just aren't in the game at the moment.
That's right. I mean, the Democratic Party is for all intents and purposes a dead duck at the moment. It's fighting with itself. It's got the various different factions going out and trying to assert themselves ahead of the midterms next year, and then of course everyone still thinks of 2028, and it's very, very difficult at the moment to identify who might be a legitimate Democratic candidate in 2028. I mean, people talk about a return of Kamala Harris. There are other people around, but at the moment there's a lot of factional fighting, and it seems a long way off. The Democrats have got a problem, and they had two generational leaders in living memory in Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, and those people don't come around very often, and they really are struggling to find someone who can just grasp the party, shake it up, and turn it into a legitimate opposition.
And they're trying to get the country's attention, trying to get just give Democrat supporters something to cheer. I mean, just in the House earlier today, while we're speaking, there's been a debate over in the House on Capitol Hill. The Democratic leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, has been speaking. Should we just have a quick listen back to some of that?
During the dawn of the Republic, it was once observed that when people fear the government, there is tyranny. When the government fears the people, there is liberty. Donald Trump and Republicans thought they could shock and awe us into submission. They thought we would be too complacent to stand up for liberty and justice for all. They thought we would walk away from the principle of equal protection under the law. They thought wrong. They thought wrong. They thought wrong. Trump's unconstitutional assault on the American way of life is unprecedented. But the so-called dictator on day one is learning an important lesson. Americans don't bend the knee to bullies. In the face of tyranny, we join together. In the face of tyranny, we rise up together. In the face of tyranny, we get into some good trouble together. And we're just getting started.
Well, that was Hakeem Jeffries, the Democrat leader in the House of Representatives, a party which, frankly, is still pretty leaderless, but doing their best to make their voices heard. Alistair Dorber, still with me here in our pop-up studio in D.C., the Times Washington correspondent. And Alistair, we can now both talk to our next guest, Igor Novikov. He used to advise President Zelensky on America issues. Good afternoon, and welcome, and thank you for joining us, Igor.
Hello, John. Hi.
Good to have you here. Can I ask you, first of all, Igor, you are, as I know from previous conversations, pretty well plugged in with what's going on in the president's office and in the Ukrainian parliament. This minerals deal, which we're told is ready to be signed if the Ukrainian parliament want to go along with it. Does it look to you, Igor, like a good deal for Ukraine? And if it does, what's good about it?
Well, the deal that I've seen, at least the last version of it, because one thing I said today was when everyone was getting happy and ecstatic that it was going to be signed, I said, like, I'll believe it when I see it, that signature. And, you know, there are still some hurdles, as we can see. But the last version of the deal that I saw is actually mutually beneficial and sane, as I called it. So there is no $500 or $100 billion debt assigned to Ukraine. there's equal representation and management of that fund. All the details look sane, and it's less of a minerals deal. It's more of like a framework investment deal on how to rebuild Ukraine, which is good news, obviously. But there's a very interesting nuance. If it gets signed, that will be the test for President Trump to see if he can deliver with Putin. Because at the moment, he can blame everything on Ukraine and Zelensky. When that deal is signed and the United States of America has actually got vested interest in Ukraine, if Russia keeps attacking that interest, now it's make it or break it for Trump.
Right. So that's a massively important question. But more immediately, Igor, I'm seeing reports this morning that some of President Zelensky's officials have been in direct contact with American officials about precisely that, about targeting some sanctions on Putin in Russia. Can you throw any light on that? Is there any sign of movement on the American side? And I'll get Alistair's view in a second. But do you see any from where you sit?
Well, it doesn't work like that with the Trump presidency. Basically, it's to do with how he feels about the negotiation process, what mood he wakes up in. So regardless of what's being discussed, it will be up to President Trump to decide whether to sanction Russia, to provide extra military assistance if needed to Ukraine, or any other moves to make to show strength to Putin, because let me remind you, Putin only responds to strength.
Right. Alistair, I guess you're going to recognize that picture. What matters when it comes to the now U.S. administration is the mood of the moment, more particularly Donald Trump's mood of the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's changed insofar as Ukraine's concerned over the last few days.
Has it materially?
I think so. In Donald Trump's mind, we've seen much more forceful criticism of Vladimir Putin in recent days. I think that the meeting that he held with Vladimir Zelensky in the Vatican for Pope Francis's funeral at the weekend was significant. The optics of that, as we know, them sitting across in a huge, great big hall. I think certainly the tone has changed on Ukraine since that meeting. He's been much more forceful in his criticism of Vladimir Putin. We've heard from people like Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, only yesterday afternoon, saying that it could be time for the US to walk away from negotiations on a ceasefire if both sides, not just the Ukrainians, we've said a lot of criticism of the Ukrainians up to this point, if both sides can't sit down and do a deal. And of course now, if this minerals deal does get signed, there is vested interest in Ukraine. America is a partner in a potentially highly lucrative agreement, both for Ukraine and for the US, and it's mutually beneficial. I think that the mood music is changing, but of course the sort of kicker to that, of course, is that it can change again.
Yes.
We know that things can spin on a dime, as they say here, and Donald Trump's attitude to any particular side in this war can change at a moment's notice.
That's a really powerful point, Alistair. I mean, Igor Novikov, Alistair's got a point, hasn't he? If it's that easy to get President Trump to change his mind, sitting, not exactly an everyday circumstance, I accept, sitting together in a couple of chairs in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, but if that was what it took to change his mind, can you still trust what he may say in the future, Igor?
Well, I disagree with the fact that it's that easy to change his mind, because I've been there from day one and I've seen the arc of their relationship with Zelensky develop. It's not as simple as people think. So it's not a love-hate relationship. And, for example, one thing I said today, that it's a common misconception that Zelensky actually dislikes President Trump. There's a lot of sympathy there, latent sympathy. So,
really, yeah.
It's a long story, but that meeting in the Vatican was important because it wasn't distorted by any of the advisors, because you have to remember that Trump's inner circle is a very interesting group of people with different worldviews and different approaches to every single problem, and they're all characters, and similar things could be said about President Zelensky. So the fact that they were face-to-face and one-on-one was important. But once again, the most important thing now, President Trump is adamant to build this world where the strong kind of rule the weak. It's blatant, it's obvious. And, if you consider his psyche and his personality, a certain degree of narcissism there, and I'm underestimating by a wide margin there. In that world, his first test as to how strong he is, whether he's strong enough for Putin, comes right after the final signature on that deal, even before it's ratified by the parliament, even before Ukraine's parliament starts changing legislation to make that deal work, because that's another step that needs to be taken, and it's going to take a while. But once kind of that minerals deal is out of the way, now it's up to Trump to show whether he's strong enough. And if he fails in that, he becomes unpredictable.
Okay, there's a lot there I wish I could dig into further, especially taken by the idea that President Zelensky actually quite likes Donald Trump. That was new on me. We'll have to take that up on a future conversation. Igor Novikov, thank you so much. Alistair Dorby, lovely to see you, mate. We'll see.
Thank you.
We'll talk again soon here in Washington, D.C. And coming up in a short while here on the programme, well, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, seem to be singing from different hymn sheets when it comes to net zero. How can they get back in accord if that is remotely possible? I'll talk to the Cabinet Minister, Heidi Alexander, in just a moment here on Times Radio Drive in Washington, D.C., in association with NatWest Cushion. Making workplace pensions and savings easy. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more. Now, let me just welcome to the programme, live on the line, the Transport Secretary and the Cabinet, Heidi Alexander. Hello to you, Heidi. Welcome.
Good evening, John. Thanks for having me on.
Always welcome, Heidi. Let me ask you first about the story, which is it's generated a good many and big headlines. Tony Blair. When Tony Blair speaks, he is listened to, especially in number 10 Downing Street, Heidi. And now we've got Tony Blair saying there should be a radical reset of what he called irrational net zero policies. He said those policies were doomed to fail. He said that voters were being asked to make financial sacrifices and changes in lifestyle that would have minimal effects on global emissions. It was pretty dismissive stuff. The last thing you want to hear from your former leader and Prime Minister.
Well, look, I think this may have been a case of a headline being created from a sort of partial reading of the report that was published. Tony has said today, as I understand it, that the current approach of the UK government to the net zero transition is entirely the right one. Some of the points that he was making, as when I read through the report quickly, was about things like investment in carbon capture and storage. That's why, as a government, we've invested over 20 billion. He was making the point that, of course, we're not going to eradicate our use of fossil fuels overnight. That was never going to be the case. And the approach of this government is that we've got a phased and responsible approach to the transition to net zero. And we recognise that we need to apply pragmatism and logic to this, and we need to meet people where they are. And if I think about some of the decisions that I've taken in the last couple of months with things like introducing new flexibilities to the zero emission vehicles mandate and saying that the sale of hybrid cars, plug-in hybrids, full hybrids, things like the Toyota Prius can be sold through until 2035. I think that shows that pragmatism that we have as a government in action. Of course, it's right that we maintain our legally binding commitment to the 2050 net zero target. And, I don't think that Tony is suggesting that we should resile from that. And so I think there's probably more alignment and more overlap than you might suggest.
Yeah, I'm not saying you're entirely at odds with Tony Blair, but I'm saying there are some interesting nuances and differences of perspective here, which are worth teasing out, because this is an important national conversation, Heidi, which you would not dispute for a second. And let's completely accept, too, that there are those who support action on climate change who say, look, what really matters here are technological changes that are taking place in industry now that will do a great deal to drive down polluting emissions. And beyond that, I'll give you this one too, just for the sake of the conversation, which is that the government is pursuing independence from sources of fossil fuel energy that we don't want to be dependent upon. But all of that said, and all of that acknowledged and conceded in this conversation, when Tony Blair talks about financial sacrifices from the British public, which are going to have a minimal effect, it makes that case for you harder and not easier to make, Heidi, doesn't it? Quite simply.
So I think we're very conscious of what we're asking the British public to do in a time when I know that household bills will be landing on doormats and people will say, actually, times are still pretty tough. But I do think we are being pragmatic and reasonable in our approach to this. One of the things that Tony was also talking about in that report today, and that I've had some experience with in the last couple of months in my role as Transport Secretary, is, of course, our approach to aviation and flying as well. And it is very true to say that if you look at demand for flying, it is going up and up. And, I don't have children myself, but I do have nieces and nephews. And I want them to be able to travel to other parts of the world in ways which I have been able to. I don't want to restrict their ability to do that. I represent constituents who have family members in other parts of the world, and I represent businesses who trade internationally. So if we are going to see an increase in people flying, then I think we've got a moral responsibility as a government to run as fast as we can towards greening aviation, and that's precisely what we are doing. We have established the Sustainable Aviation Fuels mandate in January of this year, within 6 or 7 months of coming into government, and that puts a requirement on the jet fuel suppliers to have a certain amount of green aviation fuel, and we will also be introducing legislation to Parliament to provide some guarantees to potential investors in this area as well, so that we can scale up the commercial production of sustainable aviation fuel in the UK. And this is about good jobs, well-paid jobs of the future. Before the election, we did talk about the fact that, there's a global race on, and we as the UK need to win that race. And I think that is really what is driving the approach of this government.
Okay, I mean, I hear your argument. This is an enormously important subject, and in an important discussion between adults, there will be disagreements. But, on the level of politics, I mean, I'm guessing, Heidi, you would rather Tony Blair had made his adult contribution privately and not so publicly. Is that fair?
Well, I think Tony's report today was a report that will have an international audience. He was, talking about the relative contributions of the developing world, the developed world. And, he's someone who has huge experience. And, the fundamental point, which I come back to, he was saying, look, we need to have some pragmatism in all of this and apply some logic. And I think that is what the government is doing. And the two examples I've given, both around our approach to aviation and to the transition to electric vehicles. And we're making real progress on electric vehicles, John. 1 in 5 cars sold last year was an EV. We're putting in charging infrastructure at the rate of 1 new charge point every half an hour.
And you softened your targets, towards net zero when it comes to electric vehicles.
So we've maintained the 2030 phase-out date for the sale of new petrol and diesel cars. That was a commitment that we made in the general election, and we have maintained that commitment. What we have done is say that hybrid vehicles, either a plug-in car or a full hybrid, things like the Toyota Prius, that can be sold through until 2035. And we've also given car manufacturers additional flexibilities in order to meet the headline trajectory in the mandate. And so that's about, if they're cleaning up the rest of the car fleet that they are selling, then they can use credits essentially to meet the targets. And so it's a common sense, practical approach that helps industry, but also gives confidence and certainty to consumers. And I think that's the balance that we need to get right here.
Okay, it was important to get your thoughts on this subject, and also your take on what we've heard from the former Prime Minister. There's a very immediate problem on the government's table just at the moment. That is about a trade deal with the United States. I'm speaking to you live from Washington, D.C. And the latest that I see reported on that subject is that America, it's coming from around Donald Trump, that they want to see access for American food products and farm products to the British market. We are in the process, Britain, of looking for a deal with the European Union, which would, if it's carried through as one might expect, it's going to stop those American products getting into the British market, and that could threaten a US-UK trade deal. Heidi, would that be a price worth paying?
So obviously there are two really important trade discussions that the UK government is part of at the moment. One of those is the discussion with the US, and the other one is part of the reset that we are going through with the EU and the review of the trade and cooperation agreement there. The Prime Minister has been clear that we will never lower our standards when it comes to working with other countries on a trade deal on food. And so any US imports would need to meet UK food standards, and that does mean...
And if that's sunk a US deal, then so be it.
Look, chlorinated chicken, hormone-treated beef are and will remain illegal in the UK. And so we've got to make sure that the discussions that we are having with the US as well as with the EU are in alignment with one another. And I know that my colleagues in government, whether it's Johnny Reynolds at the Department for Business and Trade, Nick Thomas-Symonds, who's leading on the work with the EU, that they're really joined at the hip in the way that they're approaching both of these sets of discussions at the moment.
Cabinet Minister Heidi Alexander, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, John.
Now, coming up, good to talk to you, Heidi. Now, just after the news, we're going to be looking at public health in the United States. And, amid all the other, pretty heated discussions, public health is right up there on the scale of high octane and high temperature, as you will find out, I think, in just a moment. I want to hear what you are thinking. I'm inviting you through the programme today to give your advice in a moment, in a sentence to Donald Trump. Imagine you've got his ear. Imagine you've got his attention. 5 seconds or so in a line. What's your advice to Donald Trump? Send me a text, 87222. Start with the word Times, or a tweet to @TimesRadio. Now then, you can watch us, by the way, on YouTube. We're there for you live now. You can see as well as hear what's going on in our pop-up studio in Washington, D.C. It is 5:32, so here's the news with Martin Wood.
Within 24 hours, officials say there are still some final hurdles before an agreement can be reached between the two countries. Donald Trump's insisted his tariffs aren't to blame after figures show the American economy contracted in the first 3 months of the year. The Commerce Department reported a 0.3% dip, the worst performance in 3 years. The US president says it's his predecessor's fault.
That's Biden. That's not Trump, because we came in on January, this is the quarterly numbers, and we came in and I was very against everything that Biden was doing in terms of the economy, destroying our country.
But the data reveals the main culprit was a surge in imports as firms stockpiled to beat threatened trade tariffs. A prolific child sex offender has been jailed for 46 years for abusing boys in his care across several counties. Richard Burrows, an 81-year-old former housemaster and scout leader, went on the run for 27 years. He was arrested at Heathrow Airport when he returned from Thailand last March. Phone footage showing the moment the famous Sycamore Gap tree crashed to the ground to the sound of a chainsaw has been played to jurors. 2 men deny causing criminal damage to the tree and to Hadrian's Wall in September 2023. And Downing Street's rejecting Sir Tony Blair's claim that hysteria is playing into the international debate on net zero. Labour's former Prime Minister says the current government's approach to limit fossil fuels is wrong. And for a news bulletin when you want it, search for the Times News Briefing on any podcast platform.
This is Times Radio.
What if your bank did more than just bank? With HSBC Premier, it's like carrying your own entourage in your wallet. Premier Wealth Management? Check. Premier Health Perks? All clear. Premier Travel Benefits? You're covered. And Premier International Banking? Si, oui, yo, ya. In fact, everything's Premier when your bank account is. Search HSBC Premier. HSBC UK, opening up a world of opportunity. Apply with £100,000 annual income or £100,000 savings or investments with HSBC UK or Premier status abroad.
Seconds. That's the difference between life and death. I've seen it firsthand. I'm Javed Abdelmonem, a doctor with Médecins Sans Frontières. As conflicts continue to spread across the world, it's crucial we can act fast. As an MSF doctor, I may need to stop life-threatening bleeding, treat gunshot wounds, or care for blast victims, all in a matter of seconds. That's why at Médecins Sans Frontières we don't waste any time. We're working in more conflict zones than you may be aware of, giving everything to give people a chance. Just 30.
Now, it was 25 days into the new presidency when Robert F. Kennedy was confirmed as the new health secretary. By day 38, there was a measles outbreak in Texas. You've got a health secretary now during a measles outbreak who wants to highlight what he sees as the perils of vaccines. What does Eric Feigl-Ding think about that? Who's a public health expert at the research institute, the NECSI. Welcome to you, Eric. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Can I ask you first? Good to have you here. Can I ask you first of all, can you tell us, are Americans safer or more at risk from infectious diseases and epidemics since President Trump and his new health secretary came into office?
Oh, Americans are definitely much more imperiled in terms of all things public health. We're talking about not just infectious diseases, we're talking about poisonings from the waters, the air. There is so many things we actually don't even know anymore because we've dismantled the very agencies and offices within the CDC that monitor these public health safety. So it's almost like if see no evil, hear no evil, if you test for no evil. And right now we are very, very much like decimated in terms of our capacity to even know what's going on, not to mention respond to these crises, these outbreaks, and other public health calamities.
Right, I guess the exemplar of the argument you're making there is what has happened in Texas with an outbreak of measles. There have been deaths. What's the latest on that?
Oh, I think there's like 2 deaths, but we're over, in terms of cases, we're well over 900. I think we're almost at 1,000 cases, probably well over 1,000 if we count all the undercounted ones.
How does that compare to the situation before the arrival of the new health secretary and the new president?
Well, previously we only had a very spotty, small outbreaks. And I think in many ways, there were going to be outbreaks because there's so much vaccine disinformation. And let's not forget that RFK Jr. is always known as the king of anti-vax. His Children's Health Defense was notoriously one of the worst, largest, well-funded anti-vax organizations that's been proliferating this anti-vaccine sentiment and disinformation for years. And now, of course, you've made that guy who is the king of anti-vax the health secretary, and everyone around him has this emperor no clothes that we cannot say we recommend the MMR vaccine. Like literally all his medical staff around him, they cannot say we recommend parents get the MMR vaccine. They just don't say anymore, and it's very, very dangerous.
Eric, is it possible to directly link the new health secretary's attitude, skepticism about vaccine, which is very, very widely publicized, and the outbreak of measles that we have seen? Is that possible to join those dots directly?
I think you can definitely make an argument for that, because look, he's telling people, oh, just get vitamin A, that will ward off this measles, and now we have vitamin A poisonings. Vitamin A, it works in malnourished populations in developing countries, but here no one's malnourished in vitamin A. But meantime, they're literally punting and telling people, because in order to stop this pandemic, stop this outbreak of measles, you need like this herd immunity. And in many parts of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, there is very, very little MMR vaccinations in these clusters. Yeah. And if it finds any hotspot, it's going to grow. And if he goes there, he actually visits there and tells them, just stay the course. You don't need to get the vaccine. Of course, this outbreak is going to further proliferate. And I think it's going to come up in even more pockets. And I think we're in a world of hurt coming in the next few years.
All right, look, I want to talk about autism, because yesterday I spoke to Carla Sands, who's a former diplomat and advisor to President Trump. She's obviously part of the strong MAGA faithful supporters of Donald Trump. Now, on the subject of autism, she had this to say. Just have a listen back.
They've never even done studies on what causes autism. How come not? Why aren't any of these vaccines actually tested before they're given to children? They're not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of people, including in this country, are worried about that analysis.
Yeah, well, let's find out. Let's use scientific analysis and find out the cause.
Okay, let me ask you about a very
active point. Can you imagine ending that? That's a scourge on so many families.
So that's Carla Sands expressing herself very, very, very strongly. Tell me what your thoughts listening to that.
So I'm an epidemiologist. I've spent my entire career in schools of public health conducting research, and let me tell you, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of peer review published in high medical journal respected papers that show vaccines, MMR vaccines, many other vaccines do not cause autism. Actually, there's one of the largest studies in the world in Denmark. A lot of these Nordic countries have like universal healthcare and linkages with everything. So everyone who takes vaccines and everyone who develops any diseases, we have data on them. And they actually show that the vaccine, MMR vaccine, actually reduces the risk of autism in the Danish study. And it's one of the world's largest studies. It's their national database and this is just one tip of the iceberg. This is the most recent study. We have decades of research. Other than the Andrew Wakefield retracted scandal paper, which we know that he was very conflicted, we have dozens and dozens of studies. And this is this is not cherry picked. These are national studies, mega, with a couple 100 million years of person time. I'm an epidemiologist. This is literally the kind of research we do. And for them to say, there's no studies on this, what dystopian universe, do they live in? This is absolutely ludicrous. I can point you to dozens of papers. Any scientist can.
Yeah. Eric Feigl, you clearly feel very strongly about this. I think we get that message, and you're gesticulating so vigorously. You nearly knocked over our camera in the corner of the studio. But Eric, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Now, here in our DC studio, let me just shift the conversation over to something we've been touching on in the course of the day and yesterday, and it won't be the only time. I'm talking about America's place in the world when it comes to strategic alliances, when it comes to the stability of those alliances, when it comes to the war in Ukraine as an exemplar of the defense, quite simply, the defense of freedom. A familiar voice on the program, very welcome now, is Ben Hodges. General Ben Hodges is a former commanding general of the United States Army in Europe and a senior NATO mentor for logistics. General, lovely to have you back.
John, thank you for the privilege.
You're on the line to us. Thank you, General, from the city of Frankfurt. General Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, you may well have noticed this already. He posted on social media this morning that America is now stronger, safer, and more prosperous 100 days into Donald Trump's presidency. How do you assess America's standing as leader of the free world and defender of those values now?
Well, first of all, I have to say I'm embarrassed for Secretary Rubio. When he was Senator Rubio, he was known for being a strong pro-NATO transatlanticist. He's the child of refugees, and now he's a completely different person, reflecting what this administration believes. I doubt that he really believes all that, because what has made the United States so secure for decades was the fact that we were part of the most successful defensive alliance in the history of the world. Not just having countries that were joined together for collective defense, but the intelligence sharing that goes along with that, the network of relationships, the access that the United States has because of our alliances. And this administration has done more damage than the Kremlin could have ever dreamed in just 100 days.
Now, look, we've seen the Pentagon, just over from where I am now, over in Arlington, the headquarters of the American military machine, vast machine that it is. That's been described in recent days as being in chaos, as being in disarray. And I'm not quoting some political opponent here. This was someone who was an advisor to the new Secretary for Defense, Pete Hegseth. Now, Hegseth was, of course, involved in leaking military secrets on a social media messaging app. And all these top advisors, General, have now been sacked or resigned. I just have to wonder, your former colleagues at the highest level of U.S. military command, what will they be saying now? What will they be thinking now?
Well, of course, they are appalled the fact that the Secretary of Defense, who has to be not only the leader, who's directly in the chain of command by law over all of the combatant commanders. So General Cavoli, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, reports directly to Secretary Hegseth. And the people around the secretary, of course, professional military women and men of all of our armed services, plus not to mention the thousands of professional civilians that have worked in the Department of Defense. They see this. I mean, the lack of professionalism, the use of a signal chat group that has been well documented thus far. I think the thing that's most worrying to me is the fact that the secretary has never accepted, hey, I screwed up here. This was a big mistake. And one of the first principles of leadership is to accept responsibility. Otherwise, you'll never fix anything. And I think this is a bad example for all of our leaders. I would also say that, John, what's in the front of my mind every day now is a quote from President Trump in his last term when he told his then Chief of Staff, General Kelly, I want generals like Hitler had. And of course, what he was talking about is he wanted generals that would say, yes, sir, and carry out whatever order was given. And here in the second administration, in just the first 100 days, the administration has removed many senior officers, and they've removed the senior judge advocates general, the lawyers from each of the services. And I think it's clear that Mr. Hegseth is only in his position because of unquestioned loyalty. I worry that senior officers now will have to pass some sort of loyalty test above and beyond the normal oath to the Constitution.
General, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, he left that office in obvious and public doubt about the first Trump administration's loyalty to the U.S. Constitution. And the more recent chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Brown, he was fired for his support for equality and diversity in the military. Do you, General, believe that this administration can ultimately be trusted? This is such an important question. Can they be trusted to defend and to support America's most basic freedoms and values, do you think?
I think they are trampling all over the Constitution on a daily basis. We see what the Attorney General does, what various parts of this administration are doing with regards to rule of law, due process, all things that we took for granted. And maybe that's our fault, that we just assumed that any president, you may disagree with policy, but you would never imagine that a president or his administration would trample over things as basic as due process. And yet that's what's happening in front of us every day. What's also worrisome, though, is that where are the senior Republicans in the Congress? A separate branch of government, not under the administration. They are a separate branch, but yet it looks to me that some old, long-serving conservative Republicans like Senator Thune or Senator Wicker or Lindsey Graham and so on, they have completely abdicated the authority that they have under the Constitution. They are not serving as a check or balance on this administration.
Well, let me give you an alternative viewpoint here. Speaking to a Republican congressman just a short while ago, who said that lower down the military pecking order, the men and women in uniform, the ordinary ranks, the other ranks, they strongly support this administration. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, there has always been inside the military, you have women and men from all over America. So of course that's going to reflect the differing political views. But the fact is, the beauty of it was that the military is apolitical. You're not allowed to participate in protests in uniform. You're expected to vote, but that's it. And how do you know what somebody's views are? I do worry that there's an increasing politicization of the military, and that we've got to make sure that our senior leaders are constantly reminding soldiers, your oath is to the Constitution. That means they will have to serve by example. They will have to be willing to give their best professional advice, even if the secretary or the president don't want to have it.
All right, General Ben Hodges, as always, really interesting to hear your take. Thank you. Now, back home in the good old UK, Kate McCann's going to be with Stig Abel, as always, at 6 tomorrow on Times Radio Breakfast, and she's on the line. How's you, Kate?
Hi, John.
Hi. So what have you got in store for tomorrow?
Well, we won't be talking about politics tomorrow, or at least not local politics, because of the local elections that are happening around the country. So we'll be focusing on the bigger picture. We'll be getting the latest on that potential minerals deal that may well be signed in the next 24 hours. The Ukrainians are indicating that may well be the case. We'll dig into that a little bit with some experts and work out what it means for the potential ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. And we're also going to be speaking to Sharon Graham, huge union boss. There's lots of questions about Birmingham bins. We can talk about that because there are no local elections in that area, but also about net zero too. It's a row that Labour is really trying to get to grips with after Tony Blair's report. It's caused quite a few problems for the party today. We'll speak to a couple of union bosses actually about the fallout from that.
It's going to be so interesting to hear that. I mean, the Labour MPs at Westminster, from all you hear, they are still pretty squarely on side with Keir Starmer. If they've got doubts, they're swallowing them. Not so some of those union bosses. Not so Sharon Graham at Unite. Looking forward to that conversation. Now, Kate tomorrow with Stig at 6 on Times Radio. And coming up right here from Washington, D.C. with me on Drive, going to be talking to Mikey Smith and Kate Ferguson from the London political lobby. I'm going to be joined right here in our D.C. Forgive my dislocation there, a bit disorientated. Should have got over my jet lag by now. Talking to Katie Bowles and Molly Ball from the Wall Street Journal. Now, I'm John Pienaar on Times Radio, live from Washington in association with NatWest Cushion, putting your employees in control of their financial future. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more.
Radio.
And I'm joined live on the line by Pastor Mark Burns, who is the spiritual advisor to President Trump. Welcome to the program, Pastor.
Happy to be here as always.
And good to talk to you again. We have spoken in the past. I'm going to ask you this straight away, if I may. And trust me, this is a genuine curiosity, not any level of facetiousness here. It is your belief, I know, that the president was chosen by God to become president for a second time. Let me ask you then, in your view, has President Trump lived up to the faith of the Almighty?
Well, absolutely. I mean, again, we have the most Christian president politically and policy-wise than we've had in ages in the White House. I mean, the reestablishment of the faith office, the fact that we are challenging and biological men participating in female sports, the fact that again President Trump chose the Supreme Court justice, nominated Supreme Court justices to return back Roe v. Wade. I can go on and on and on, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. For the faith-based community, the president has done exactly what God has ordained him to do, and to bring God back to the center of America.
So, Pastor, tell me, late Pope Francis, he very openly criticized President Trump's deportations of migrants. Pastor, was the Pope wrong?
Well, of course, the Pope was wrong. Again, the fact of the matter is there were over 700,000 violent crimes that took place at the hand of illegal immigrants that have entered the country illegally. The fact that the president, within the first 100 days, passed the Lincoln-Riley Act, so that no one will be able to what happened to Lincoln won't happen to no one else again. And so the president has a moral obligation to protect the citizens of the United States of America.
Yes.
Again, that is not to block people from entering the country, simply just come through the correct and right way. But the fact that the president has now declared 7 Latin American gangs as domestic terrorists, when we've arrested MS-13 gangbangers that have raped, killed, and drugs and all of the things that has taken place. The president has a moral obligation to take care of the citizens, and to which he's sworn to protect and defend.
Yes. Okay, but I'm touching on a question of justice and fairness in the context of Christianity here. I mean, the deportations the president is promising and now carrying out, they are about deterrence, Pastor, aren't they? We're talking, it's fair to summarize them, I think, as cruelty with a purpose. Now, is cruelty and fear a truly Christian course of action?
Well, I think, again, let's go back to the Vatican. You mentioned the Pope. You cannot just walk inside the Vatican. It's just foolishness to suggest that you can just walk inside any organized sovereignty, any sovereign nation unannounced, and expect to say Christianity allows you to stay. No, we do protect those.
But of course, Pastor, the Vatican,
a lot of
Pastor, the Vatican. Yeah, but the Vatican, of course, Pastor, does not send people who walk into the Vatican, with or without permission, to foreign prisons with no due process. And this administration does do that. Is that in tune, in your judgment, Pastor, is that in tune with Christian values?
Well, I think the real question is what is the moral obligation of the president? Remember, the president of the United States of America is not the pastor of the United States of America. Now, ask me for my point of view, from my positioning as a pastor, what I would do. And so for me, I would, again, if these are criminals, they deserve to go to jail because the Bible says we reap what we have sown. And these individuals that have been, and there was due process. I mean, again, that is fake news to keep repeating that the gentleman that you're speaking about that was sent back to El Salvador, that he was not, there was no due process. Remember, he has a criminal record, right? And the fact of the matter is he and his own wife or ex-wife talked about how violent he was. And so it's a democratic cry, it's a political cry, and it's misinformation.
Forgive me for interrupting, but you'll understand we're just so short of time. And there's something I do want to ask you about. I know, Pastor, you have been to Ukraine and you came back from Ukraine with an altered view of U.S. policy. Please do tell me about that.
Well, again, it just goes to realizing that Ukraine is bigger than a yellow and blue flag that you see on CNN or Fox News. They're real people, real living, breathing people. And when I was able to get through the fake news of media, and that includes the left and the right, both sides who gives misinformation to sway a particular popular ideology. I realized that when you see the 700 churches and mosques and synagogues that have been destroyed at the hands of the Russians, when you hear about the killings and you see the white bandanas that was designed to be a sign that these are non-combatants, but these Russians took the same white bandanas and they tied the hands of innocent civilian people and shooting them in the back of the head. When you hear the 20,000 kidnapped children that took place, left and right politics goes out the window. Democrat, Republican goes out the window. Whether you like Zelensky, whether you like or dislike President Trump, all of that went out the window. These are human beings. I'm not speaking for the government of Ukraine, but the innocent people. Somebody needs to speak up for them. And I'm happy the president is listening, and I'm happy that that there's a deal that's coming to the end of the table soon.
Okay. Well, look, Pastor, from all you say, you speak with great conviction, and I can see that it's rooted in your moral sense as well. But the president is not taking your advice right now and acting against Putin for the reasons you set out there. You seem to be on a different page. You're allowed to be on a different page from the president. Of course you are, but you do seem to be.
Well, that's not true. I mean, the president is putting even greater pressure on Vladimir Putin. To suggest that he's not putting pressure on President Putin is a lie. It is misinformation. The president has made it very clear.
He's not taking sanctions. He's not imposing fresh sanctions.
Well, I mean, the president has made it very clear. There's a deal that's on the table. It is a very close deal. They just met at the Vatican. Information is being passed. The president is most definitely listening. He's putting more public pressure and private pressure. You don't have no idea all the things that the president is putting onto Vladimir Putin, trying to prevent from having these secondary tariffs on Russian oil and to those that will buy Russian oil. He's trying to prevent that from happening because it will just cripple the economy of the innocent Russian people, that are there. He doesn't want that happen to them either. But the president will do it if Vladimir Putin doesn't come to an end.
He's speaking. Okay, so the president's acting out of concern for the welfare of the Russian people. Last question, in a word, if I may. Forgive me for this brevity. I know you're seeing the president tomorrow.
Let me be very clear, because I want to be very clear. The president is on the side of peace. He's not on the side of Ukraine or the side of Russia. He's on the side of peace. And whatever it's going to take so that the 5,000 Ukrainian and Russian soldiers that are dying, the innocent Ukrainians that are getting killed, the babies that are getting their heads blown off, the real graphic things that are happening that I am seeing now with my own eyes. He wants that to stop. And it's not about Russia. He's not a friend of Russia. Putin is evil, but the president wants peace. He is not friends with anyone that are aggressing, killing people. That's what the president is stopping.
Okay, Pastor Mark Burns, Pastor to the President. Thank you for joining me, Pastor, this afternoon. More coming up. Pienaar and friends, I'm in Washington, D.C., and we've got a lot to talk about.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the times.
It's 6 o'clock. I'm John Pienaar. Welcome to Pienaar and Friends. I am in Washington, D.C. We've got two sets of conversations on either side of the Atlantic. In a moment, Mikey Smith from The Mirror and Kate Ferguson from The Sun on Sunday, back home in Blighty. And after 6:30 here in D.C., I'll be talking to Katie Bowles, the Washington editor of The Times, and Molly Ball from The Wall Street Journal. And you, I hope, join us, share your thoughts, and we can chat after the news with Martin Williams.
John, thank you. Good evening. Officials in Ukraine say a minerals deal with the US could be signed within 24 hours. It's understood there are final hurdles to overcome before an agreement can be reached between the two countries. Ambassador John Bolton is a former national security advisor to Donald Trump.
The idea that Ukraine would be required to pay for military assistance that has already been conveyed is out, which I think is fair. I also think it's fair to say to Ukraine, okay, so we've helped you a great deal for free, but going forward, we hope you can pay for a little bit more of this. We did this in World War II. We've done it in every war we fought in.
The US president's urging Americans to be patient, saying his tariffs will eventually lead to a boom in the economy. But figures show it shrunk in the first quarter, with experts saying it was weighed down by a deluge of goods imported by businesses eager to avoid higher costs. Donald Trump's blamed it on his predecessor, calling it Biden's stock market. Harry Broadman's a former US Assistant Trade Representative and used to be Chief of Staff of the President's Council of Economic Advisers. He's given Times Radio his assessment of the figures.
It is a function of the trade war in the sense that people were expecting this, and so people were stocking up. And so that has a negative impact on GDP growth. But the real test is what's going to be happening in the next quarter. One of the problems with the buying up of supplies prior is you may not have as much purchasing ahead. So that will also have an effect on that number.
The first known victim of serial paedophile Richard Burrows says he regrets not reporting his assault immediately to save others. Burrows, a former scoutmaster who spent 27 years on the run, has been sentenced to 46 years in jail after being convicted of dozens of sexual assaults against young boys from the 1960s to the mid-90s. He's now 81. Crews are tackling a large wildfire in the Peak District. People living near Irwood Reservoir in Derbyshire have been told to keep their doors and windows closed as smoke billows through the area. Councils will be given CCTV cameras and drones to crack down on the illegal dumping of rubbish. The Environment Secretary Steve Reed says with a change in the law, the worst offenders could face up to 5 years in prison. Victoria Vivian is president of the Country Land and Business Association.
The really big successes here will be about the police and councils working together to help people defeat what is in fact organised crime. At some points it's been described as waste cowboys. Let's not romanticise it by talking about cowboys. Let's talk about organised crime.
And the King has offered his most personal thoughts yet on his cancer diagnosis. In a statement, His Majesty described a daunting and at times frightening experience as he hosts a reception for cancer care projects. He thanks what he calls remarkable organisations and individuals and quoted the late campaigner Dame Deborah James urging patients to find a life worth enjoying and have no regrets. And for a news bulletin when you want it, search for the Times News Briefing on the Times Radio app.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker.
Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio with NatWest Cushion.
It is really good to have you here with us on Pienaar and Friends, an hour of good conversation in lots and lots of good company. Going to start with me here, where I am in Washington, D.C., talking to two of our very familiar friends, Kate Ferguson from the Sun on Sunday and Mikey Smith from the Mirror. And after 6:30, going to be joined here in our little pop-up in D.C. By Molly Ball from the Wall Street Journal and Katie Balls from the Times. Right now, Kate, hi, good to hear from you and lovely to looking forward to the conversation.
You too, John. How are you? How's stateside?
It's really, really great to be here, Kate. I mean, look, I don't need to tell you what a story we have in our hands over here, and to see it up close and personal. Talk to some of the players we are talking to in our little pop-up here in a little corner of an office in DC. It is more than a pleasure. It is a privilege. Mikey, same to you. Good to have you with us.
Afternoon. I'm very jealous of you being in DC.
Mate, you would love it. You would love this story. And, well, so much. I'll ask you first, Mikey, what's your thought for the day?
My thought for the day, as a journalist, I think I share this with many journalists. I'm fascinated with useless bits of information about politicians. Jeremy Hunt is a great ballroom dancer. John McDonnell has a boat on the Norfolk Broads, that sort of thing. So I am obviously fascinated with the drip revelations about Kemi Badenoch's eating habits. So
Okay, I missed on that.
So we learned a few weeks ago that, a few months ago I think now, that she doesn't think sandwiches are real food.
It's not real food.
It's not real food. She won't touch bread that is soggy.
Fair.
And that sometimes she has she has a lackey go out and bring back from a fancy eatery a steak for her lunch. And this steak costs, I think it costs about £12.50, something like that, which, as I never tire of explaining to people, is not a lot of money to spend on a steak, but it is a lot of money to spend on lunch. Anyway,
that's a very curious distinction.
It's about the same as a Five Guys burger, which we decided a few weeks ago was posh.
I ruled it was posh.
So what we've learned yesterday is that Kemi, when she can't get to her fancy eatery, when she can't send someone out for her steak, she is quite partial to a Toby Carvery. And I think that's fascinating.
Do you think that's true?
I think it might be. Because, I don't know, there's something...
Mikey, maybe it's the distance, but you're just going to have to spend a moment more telling me why that's fascinating.
I don't know why it's... I think my thing is that I collect all of these things. I'm fascinated by the kind of people who become politicians. I can't imagine doing it myself, but I feel like if I collect all these nuggets of information about all these people, then eventually I will get sort of an idea. There'll be a trend somewhere. Data will emerge, and I'll realise exactly what it is that makes people become politicians, because I've never understood it really.
Okay, well, you're off on a journey with no idea of the destination or indeed the purpose of the whole exercise. Something about that appeals to me. Okay, what's your thought for the day?
Okay, I'm going to borrow my thought for the day from our greatest living artist in Britain, David Hockney, and I think Britain's become too bossy. We're constantly hectored and told what to do, and we need to just chill out and stop shouting at people. We need to end bossiness soon, please, as David Hockney says. And I'll give you an example, John. I come here, I get at London Bridge Station, and if I get on the train at London Bridge Station, a kind of voice shouts at me to stand on the right-hand side of the escalator. I know to stand on the right-hand side of the escalator and to walk up the left. Yeah. But they have to shout at you until you do it. They're constantly hectoring you. The government's bossy too. The state's bossy. They've already ruined fizzy drinks by taking all the lovely sugar out of them. No one got thin by getting rid of some of the sugar in Rubicon Mango. Yes. But Rubicon Mango became poorer for it. Now they're talking about taking the sugar out of milkshakes. What did they think milkshakes were? Like a savoury treat. It's just all very bossy and hectoring and mithering. And no wonder people are fed up with politicians. It's the age of rage, and it's because we've become bossy boots, and we need to stop being so bossy.
I think you're in the wrong country. I think you should be over here on this side of the Atlantic. Maybe with that wonderfully libertarian take on life. I think maybe you should be on a cabin up in the Appalachian Mountains on your own. Maybe with its own escalator and with your own soft drink bottle that opens just the way you like it. And why shouldn't you? We're all free people.
Thank you,
in what ought to be a free world. No, I'm with you. I won't come and see you in your cabin because you don't want company up there. You know.
You would be welcome as long as you don't tell me what to do in my own cabin.
I'm not going to do that. Looking forward to our time together in the Appalachians. Okay. All right, now look, I want to bring you some breaking news now, just in, which I think is interesting. It's worth a bit of discussion. I'll hear your thoughts on this. It's the King who has released a statement about his cancer. Now, he was speaking at a reception at Buckingham Palace for those who work with cancer patients and their families. And this is what he said. He said, each new case will be a daunting and at times frightening experience for those individuals and their loved ones. But, he says, as one among those statistics myself, I can vouch for the fact that it can also be an experience that brings into sharp focus the very best of humanity. And he paid tribute to those in cancer care. He said, it's certainly given me an even deeper appreciation of the extraordinary work undertaken by this remarkable organisation and the organisations and individuals gathered here with him this evening, many of whom I've known and visited and supported over the years. The King said, it's reinforced what I've long observed during these visits. The darkest moments of illness can be illuminated by the greatest compassion. And you can read more about that story. It's from the royal editor of The Times, Kate Mancy, and it's there for you at thetimes.com. And I want to know what you think, Katie and Mikey, because that strikes me as a moment of it's coming from the heart. It's not just another statement from the King, who's gone through an experience that I guess you have to know and been through that experience or be very close to it to have complete empathy with what he's saying. But I think that message has a certain value. Don't you agree, Casey?
Yes, definitely. And I mean, the King has spoken very poignantly about his own treatment, and obviously Kate has also been treated for cancer. So it's something that's touched the royal family's heart. And I think cancer touches so many families. We all know someone that's been affected by it or sadly lost their lives by it. And so when the royal family is able in this way to kind of talk so personally, which is quite rare really for a king to do, a monarch to do, it really raises so much awareness about that struggle, I think.
Yeah, Mikey, quick thought from you.
Yeah, no, I think I always think it's fascinating when someone like the King, who probably doesn't have much common ground with people that he talks to. There's not a lot of people who've experienced being a monarch, and he you know, he's come to talk to these cancer patients, and they have something in common. I think that's a fascinating thing, and it seems to have led him to speak with quite passionately about his experience, which is always fascinating to hear.
No. Good thoughts, guys. Now, in a moment, let's talk about some of the politics on the home front. There's a lot to talk about. Tony Blair speaking out on net zero, not in a way that I suspect Keir Starmer would ideally have wished to hear his predecessor speak, and more things besides. This is Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio. We're live in Washington, D.C. in association with NatWest Cushion, making workplace pensions and savings easy. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more. And joining us on Pienaar and Friends, Kate Ferguson from The Sun on Sunday and Mikey Smith from The Mirror. So guys, so the story has got a good deal of attention, hasn't it? Tony Blair speaking out on net zero, which seems to me it's not quite on the same page as Keir Starmer, although maybe the government and Downing Street would have it otherwise. What did Tony Blair say? Well, he said there had to be a radical reset of what he called irrational net zero policies because he said they're doomed to fail. And he said voters were, in his words, being asked to make financial sacrifices and changes in lifestyle that he said would have minimal effect on global emissions. Well, I spoke just a short while ago here on the programme to Heidi Alexander, the Transport Secretary. Asked her what she thought, and this is what she said.
Well, look, I think this may have been a case of a headline being created from a sort of partial reading of the report that was published. Tony has said today, as I understand it, that the current approach of the UK government to the net zero transition is entirely the right one. Some of the points that he was making, as when I read through the report quickly, was about things like investment in carbon capture and storage. That's why, as a government, we've invested over 20 billion. He was making the point that, of course, we're not going to eradicate our use of fossil fuels overnight. That was never going to be the case. And the approach of this government is that we've got a phased and responsible approach to the transition to net zero. And we recognise that we need to apply pragmatism and logic to this, and we need to meet people where they are.
The Cabinet Minister, Heidi Alexander, talking to me just a very short while ago. Kate Ferguson, tell me, what's your take on this story, Kate?
Well, I mean, I think Heidi Alexander's done a valiant effort there in trying to pretend they're on the same page. But, I mean, Keir Starmer needs his intervention from Tony Blair on the eve of local elections like a hole in the head. Tony Blair has told it as it is, right, which is these bans, these kind of fines being levied in this kind of desperate bid to get to net zero is just going down like a bucket of cold sick with normal people. We don't want paper straws that don't work, and we don't want people to come and rip our boilers out in 5 years, 10 years' time, and we don't want to be clobbered with fines for just driving the car we've owned for 20 years. So I think Tony Blair's on the money, Keir Starmer's not. I would bet you, I don't really do political betting because it's quite dangerous, but I would bet you good money that that you will see Keir Starmer come back again and water down the specifics of the net zero strategy. I think I said it before on this show, like he'll stick to the 2050 target, but he will come back again and water down the when those bans come in year on year. Wanted to just say one other thing. I was out on the road the other day with Nigel Farage interviewing him. Man of the moment, very much on the rise. Anyway, he told me net zero, there's so much fury around net zero. He thinks it could be the next Brexit. This kind of simmering resentment and fury that we see among people about it, being told off for just living their lives, clobbered with extra fines, all for like a kind of tiny marginal difference. Meanwhile, China's pumping out gallons and gallons of coal dust minute by minute. So Keir Starmer doesn't like this intervention. Tony Blair had it right first time, and I reckon that Keir Starmer will end up having to eat his words.
All right, Mikey Smith, what do you say to Kate and, for that matter, to Nigel Farage?
Nigel Farage. All of this is a very easy thing to say, and it sounds like it should be true. The polling doesn't bear it out.
Ugh.
If you look at polling, as I just happened to do on the way here, YouGov did a poll last month. 61% support not only net zero, but net zero by 2050. The government's plan to achieve net zero, 61% either support or strongly support.
As in, you support the target, Mikey?
Yes.
That's exactly. I didn't say they didn't support the target. I said they don't like the fines and the bans.
24% oppose it. The other poll they did, and they did this one today, only 12% of people actually think we'll achieve it. Now, there are two ways of reading that difference. One is that people just aren't very confident in Britain being able to do anything it puts its mind to, which might be true. The other is it possible that the great mind of our generation, Nigel Farage, has misread the mood of the public, and in fact, not only do people support transitioning to net zero by 2050, they think we should go further and faster, or be doing more to achieve that
John,
goal.
you'll agree with me, won't you, that with polls, it's all in the question. Oh, would you like to have lovely, nice environment and hit net zero by 2050? Tick, yes. Do you want your car forcibly taken away from you in 5 years' time and you forced to cough up, 10 grand for a new one? No, cross. It's all in the questioning, Mikey. You have put rose-tinted glasses on there and seen what you want to see.
Well, I would take that if it was like a slight, if it was a close thing, if it was
you're just answering
52-48,
a different question to me. The point is the policy.
It's 61%. That's a massive, massive plurality of people who support not only I'll say again, not only net zero, but net zero by 2050. That was in the question.
Yeah, as in, would you like this theoretical thing in ages away? Not, do you want your boiler taken away in 10 years' time? You come for my boiler, you've got a fight on your hands.
See, I trust the good British public to understand what that means.
Well, that's absolutely ridiculous. Like, why on earth? Like, I barely know all of the targets that we need to hit, and I write about it every day. Like, why on earth would a normal, average person on the street know that they're going to take your boiler away in 10 years' time?
But
sorry, John.
Kate, yeah, sure. Kate, no, much as I'm enjoying this ringside, see, but you are you're a bit of an absolutist on these things, aren't you? And you wouldn't dispute. No, there's nothing wrong with being an absolutist in defence of liberty, because that's kind of where you are. But does and I also do agree with you, by the way, that opinion polls, the answer has to be seen in the context of the precise question, and they very rarely are. Equally, though, Kate, does your point suggest that Britain shouldn't be taking action on this subject? And I get that. It's difficult for people who have got no money to spare to be presented with different charges and more charges, at any given time. But is it your argument that Britain should not be trying to take some sort of lead and let the planet go to hell in a handcart? I mean, how do you answer that countercharge, because that would be made by some?
No, I don't agree with that at all, actually. Like, of course, if you want to kind of invent new things or create new green jobs, I mean, the government bangs on about creating new green jobs. I don't know where they are. I haven't seen them created. Yeah. They bang on about solar panels. Like, totally fine, put solar panels up. I don't have a house. If I had a house, maybe I'd put solar panels on them. However, get real, those solar panels are made in China. Those are producing lovely, delicious green jobs in China. They're not producing them here. I mean, you just got to be realistic.
Well, and made by slaves.
And potentially made by Uyghur slaves, right? So you've just got to get real about it. Don't tell people a lie. And people will not accept being clobbered for higher charges and levies when it's a needle in a haystack. It's a drop in the ocean in terms of global emissions. So I just think people have to be honest and get real. Ed Miliband bangs on about these green jobs. Lovely. They sound fantastic. You tell me, Ed, where are they? I haven't seen one, but Ed, open invitation. The Sun on Sunday would love to come with you to see these amazing net zero jobs. Maybe they're in his patch of Doncaster, but I don't think they are.
Okay, just have a listen to this. I do like to get our listeners involved, guys. This voice note has come in from a Mr. Law. In answer, it seems, to you, Cal. I don't know what he's going to say, but let's find out together.
I can't help feeling that Kate is being a little bit bossy, telling us not to be bossy. Otherwise, loving the programme. Thanks very much. Have a lovely time in Washington.
Okay, well, you'll take that, Kate, won't you? He's because it's a free country. He's entitled to have a go like that.
Yeah, totally, brilliant.
All right. Mr. Law, thanks for sending your thoughts in that way. Just a couple of thoughts from both of you on. It is a big day, on any normal political cycle. Local election day tomorrow. Councillors, mayors, they're going to be standing. Big by-election in Runcorn on Friday. We'll have all the results for you through the day. Special early breakfast with Rosie right at 4 o'clock. Chloe Tilly and Callum McDonald are going to be here. Ed Vasey at 10. And Aisha Hazarika at 1. Everything you need to know, all the latest results and the best analysis you could hope to hear. Mikey, let's just set the scene a little bit for us on that local election day. We do expect Reform to have something to shout about. I mean, what's it going to shape out like, in your view, in advance of the event?
So the problem for Reform is that it's not just that they have to get loads of seats, which they do. They have to get the same number of seats as the other two main parties, the Tories and Labour. Otherwise, their national polling, which suggests that all three parties are roughly neck and neck, we know that there's a problem with that polling. So that's going to be Nigel Farage's problem. The Tories have got the problem that they are coming from a very high number. They had a vaccine bounce the last time these councils were up and had just ridiculous numbers of seats. So anything they come out with is going to look like a drubbing. Labour, on the other hand, are coming from a fairly low bar and have to pick up quite a lot of seats for it to look like anything but a referendum on Keir Starmer's leadership. So it's going to be interesting whatever happens. The Labour people I've been talking to, I mean, officially all three parties are saying, "Oh, it's going to be a tough night." Local elections are always difficult, and etc. Getting the excuses in early. A few Labour people I was talking to yesterday are. I wouldn't go much further than cautiously optimistic about places like Runcorn. I think there was an idea that they were going to do quite badly, but it doesn't seem like. It seems like it's going to be going their way, if not sort of very close.
Okay, Kate, your thoughts?
I've got a couple of thoughts. First of all, I think whatever happens, we're probably going to wake up Friday morning and it's the rise of reform. They're going to collect a bunch of new council seats, some mayoralties, potentially the Runcorn by-election. If they get all three, it's like all hail the new king, Nigel Farage, really, and that'll be the narrative. Tories are going to bleed out. The question is, how much do they bleed out? How much blame does Kemi get? Do knives get sharpened for her come Saturday morning? I suspect it's like far too early to talk about a possible leadership challenge to Kemi, but it's going to be a bad night for them. Labour, this isn't their set of elections are really next year, their council elections. But if they lose Runcorn, that is one of their safest seats in the country. Yes, by-elections go the wrong way for incumbents, but if they lose this mega safe seat, bad night for Keir. More like gloom for Keir, more brilliance for Nigel, and Keir will have to own that defeat, and people will say there should be wake-up call, does he need to reset?
Yeah, that'll be the headline, sure enough. Kate Ferguson and Mikey Smith, lovely to talk to you guys. I'll see you next time. I'll be sitting there with you on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean in my usual chair. Who's in my chair? I can't see from here. Have one of you grabbed it?
Kate is in your chair.
Obviously, I've grabbed your chair, John.
Kate, you grabbed mine. Quite right too. And more coming up on Pienaar and Friends. I'm going to be talking to friends here in Washington, D.C. Casey Balls from the Times, Molly Ball from the Wall Street Journal. We are still streaming for you on YouTube, on the Times YouTube channel. Have a watch as well as a listen, and do join in. Now it's 6:30 exactly, so here's the news with Martin Williams.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Thank you, John. Good evening. The Chancellor is being investigated by Parliament's Standards Commissioner over her entry in the Commons Register of Interests. Rachel Reeves' spokesperson says it's over a late entry. It's understood the interest had previously been declared on time in the separate Ministerial Register of Events.
How on earth do they contemplate getting anywhere near?
Well, you've just articulated exactly the problem that the Republicans in the House and Senate are now having, is that they have managed to nudge this one big, beautiful bill that Trump wants through various procedural hurdles by basically telling the different factions of the Republican caucus, don't worry about the details, we'll get there eventually, let's all be a team. But now they're getting to the point where they actually have to find these savings in practice, and it turns out to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, particularly if you're going to respect the promises that Trump has made about not cutting various entitlement programs. It's often been said that the American government is basically, an insurance program with the military. And if you're not going to cut the military, which they actually want to increase military spending, and if you're not going to cut any, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, food stamps, these big entitlement programs, which they've said they are not going to cut at least the benefits, although they may add some eligibility requirements, then it's basically impossible to achieve that kind of savings. So there are now very active discussions going on in the Congress between Republicans about whether and how they can find these savings, but it's going to be very, 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 very difficult to do, and there's going to be a lot of blood, sweat, and tears between now and when they get this bill passed.
Yeah, I just want to listen back to one of the conversations we had a little earlier on the programme when I spoke to Harry Broadman, who was a former U.S. Assistant Trade Representative, and he was Chief of Staff of the Presidential Council of Economic Advisers under both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, and he just gave us this thought on the challenges now facing President Trump.
I think his biggest problem is he's not well staffed to produce economically meaningful statistics to make his case. That's his first problem. And his probably second, but maybe even more important problem is the uncertainty that he is engendering. That's far more corrosive than the tariffs, or not tariffs. It's that no one knows what is ahead on the road. Is the road straight? Is it curvy? Are we going to take a left turn, a right turn? Is it going to be a U-turn? And that in and of itself is quite problematic.
And if we take Harry Broadman's analysis there at face value, at the moment we have, if not chaos, then comparative chaos when you compare it to a well-run government with a clear agenda, pursuing that agenda step by step. And clearing up that chaos is not going to be easy, not when you look at the people around the president, not when you look at the president, not when you even try to analyse the agenda, which in some ways defies analysis, Molly.
Yes, and I think it's important to point out that a lot of this is also bound up in the issue of the separation of powers, because the president has, although arguably, the power to impose and take away these tariffs unilaterally and make these trade deals with other countries unilaterally. He's been doing all this by executive order. He hasn't been going through the Congress. Even some of his biggest supporters when it comes to trade, who support the idea of reindustrializing America through protectionist, industrial policy, would like to see it go through the Congress, because it would create the kind of certainty that gives the business community the ability to make long-term investments. And so, in talking to people in the business community, this is a constant refrain that they might not love the idea of large across-the-board permanent tariffs, but they'd at least like to know that that's the case. And at this point, they've gone back and forth so many times with different ideas about what the tariffs are going to be, and with different projections of what is going to happen in the future, and different voices from the administration saying different things. It's become very difficult for business people just to make plans for the future, and that is clearly affecting the economic outlook.
Casey,
I mean, there are also, to add to that confusion, different theories depending who you speak to in Trump world as to the purpose of the tariffs. One being it is there for negotiation. It's all a negotiating tool, and therefore you get a bit more from these countries. The other being probably the more hard-line view, which is effectively you need to have some form of permanent tariffs because this is about manufacturing jobs back to the UK, back to the USA. It is about a restructuring of the economy, which means that and the two may have small bits of overlap, but they are quite different ways of looking at things.
Yes. I was listening to the president last night at that rally in Michigan, and over a sort of a slate of interviews that he gave at the same time with American news networks. Well, one of the things he was saying was that there is already a flood of businesses coming back onto American shores and setting up. I put that point to Harry Broadman. He said there was no evidence of that he could see at all. I mean, Molly, at the Wall Street Journal, is this just more spin? Is it more slogans?
They have announced a fair number of investments. They like to tout, these individual companies that have said they're going to come back and break ground on these various, factories or what have you. I think we're still waiting to see how many of those are real. Often, as well, we've seen what companies or even countries do is sort of put a new gloss on something they were already planning to do or had even already announced just to sort of curry favor with the administration. So it's very difficult to sort out what constitutes new investment or investment that wouldn't have happened were it not for the administration's policies versus just sort of the normal course of doing business. Certainly, most economists do not believe that it's been a net positive for the American economy, the policies thus far. And I do think, the president truthing this morning that none of this is his fault and everybody needs to be patient because this is really just still the hangover from the Biden administration. I do think this 100 days is a bit of an inflection point in that regard. We already see that voters are blaming Trump for the economy, do hold him responsible for the state of things at the moment. And that's going to be even more true going forward. It's going to be even harder to contend that somehow he had nothing to do with all this.
Yeah, I mean, those growth numbers out today. Good to get both of your thoughts on that in just a moment. And I know just spin versus truth. That's the first time I've heard the process of posting messages on Truth Social described in that way. Truthing. It's a new verb on me. There's something.
I don't know what else we're supposed to call it.
Choose your own words. There's something vaguely contradictory about the use of what the president does with Truth Social, described as truthing. But that's we kind of enjoy those ironies. This is Pienaar and Friends here in Washington DC with Molly Ball from the Wall Street Journal and Casey Bowles from the Times. Do stay with us. We're here in association with NatWest Cushion, putting your employees in control of their financial future. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more. Radio. I'm John Pienaar with Pienaar and Friends here in Washington, D.C. with Katie Ball from the Times and with Molly Ball from the Wall Street Journal. So let's talk a bit about the big economic number that dropped today, guys, which is the American economy in the first quarter of this year has shrunk. It's gone down by 0.3%. It's not as simple as the economy shrinking as an adverse reaction to Donald Trump's tariffs, but it is against the background of the awareness of those tariffs, and it's ahead of the next set of results, the next quarter, more of that, and it's going to be an official recession in America. Let's just have a quick listen to Donald Trump because he addressed that number earlier today.
Core GDP, and this is, you probably saw some numbers today, and I have to start off by saying that's Biden. That's not Trump, because we came in on January, this is quarterly numbers, and we came in and I was very against everything that Biden was doing in terms of the economy, destroying our country.
Right, so it's all Biden's fault. Molly Ball, do you want to give us some context on that?
Well, I would say, first of all, that voters don't subscribe to this. We have seen Trump's ratings on the economy turn sharply negative, that patience that he's... And of course, every politician will tell you that the electorate is notoriously impatient, that a lot of policymakers would love to have the sort of runway to implement long-term changes that might take a little bit of sacrifice up front. But it's very difficult to do that in a democracy because people want to see results immediately, and they don't want to personally sacrifice on behalf of some politicians' uncertain vision of the future. This is, however, one of the first sort of concrete signs that we're getting of a potential negative impact to the economy. For all the gyrations of the market, we have seen inflation be relatively stable, unemployment be relatively stable. We have not seen the bottom fall out of a lot of these concrete indicators. So to your point, I think the next quarter, the next few months are going to be crucial as the reality, not just the anticipation of these tariffs and other policy changes actually sinks in. We hear about potential, supply problems. We hear about, shipments and ports and so forth being affected, particularly by the China tariffs. And so, the pessimists will tell you that the real impact of this is all down the line, and that's when we're really going to see things go bad.
Yeah, another quarter like this, there'll be nowhere left to run. You can't keep on saying it's Biden. It's Biden.
Exactly.
It plainly will not be. Casey, you're nodding.
Yeah, I think completely correct. And I think by the time you get to the next quarter, it is going to be directly linked to the tariffs when it comes to these conversations. Whereas you can say tariffs are affecting business confidence, you can say it's affecting consumer confidence, but it will be, how long is this going on for? And as we've been talking about earlier on the show, the most striking thing, I think, in conversations on the tariffs, whether it is figures in the administration, figures in business, figures just watching on from where they are. It's just the sense that no one really knows what the exact strategy is or where it's going. And that's just feeding a sense of helplessness might be the wrong word, but it means it's very hard to plan. And that's when it starts to become problematic. So I think that while Donald Trump is for now, doubling down on his plans, you would expect there to be conversations about, some sense of momentum or purpose coming up, but whether that is a deal they get over the line or a plan for what they're planning to do on tariffs in the future.
I mean, in our trade, and I guess it's a reflection of public opinion too, we do tend to be impulsive and we tend to be impatient. We do like to see big breaking news in time for the next edition or for the next program, and politics doesn't work like that and economies don't work like that. But equally, the perception of a government is drifting the right word? Well, maybe it is. Certainly sort of meandering, certainly without any kind of clear route map. Now, look, let's just widen things out a little bit, and I'll just recall some of my conversation a very short while ago with John Bolton, who I will confess, always enjoy talking to John Bolton. He seems to arrive down the line or in the studio armed with both hands bearing heavy clubs, verbal clubs, which he wields freely. So we listen back to Ambassador John Bolton, the former national security advisor to Donald Trump.
Not much that Trump will do anything further to harm Russia, run, after all, by his good friend, Vladimir Putin. I think that U.S. sanctions enforcement generally is not as effective as it should be. I think this is a long-running problem. I don't think the imposition, the monitoring, the enforcement of sanctions as a whole are done very well. So I don't doubt that there's additional economic pressure the U.S. and Europe, for that matter, could put on Putin, but I don't see Trump initiating it.
Okay, so not a great deal of encouragement from John Bolton when it comes to Ukraine with a deal on mineral extraction. Certainly on the American side, they say they consider it's ready to sign. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary of the administration, he's saying it's ready to be signed. We're sure they will reconsider that. And there has been positive sounds coming out of Kyiv as well. They seem to like what they see. They think it's better than the deal they had earlier on. Couldn't be much worse. The earlier draft would look pretty larcenous. It's got to go through the Ukrainian parliament. But what will it really do for Ukraine? Ukrainian side keeps America in the game. Does it do anything to protect that country from future attack by Russia? Having this discussion even before the current attack shows any sign of ending. What's your thoughts on this, Molly?
No, I think that's really the key, is that even if they were to sign this, and I think it's significant that it still hasn't been signed, although they say they're ready, there's been clearly some kind of hiccup that's prevented it from being signed to this point. And even if it were to be signed, this is only a preliminary step. This is not any kind of a ceasefire. This is not a step that would actually end the fighting, as Trump has said over and over that he wants to do. And I think this is an important political goal for Trump, right? This is a major promise that he made, that he said he would uniquely be able to do, in part because of his relationship with Putin.
Yes.
And we don't seem any closer to doing it. And in, speaking of the Biden factor, the blame factor, just now in the cabinet meeting, you had Donald Trump saying, well, just let's all remember this is Biden's war.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't have happened if I were president. So again, we see him trying to shift blame from something that he hasn't managed to accomplish himself, at least in the first 100 days.
And when this deal, assuming this deal is finally ratified by the Ukrainian parliament, it then becomes a very real test for the president, doesn't it? Because there he is, he said a couple of times now, 2 or 3 times, he's impatient. He wants Putin to act, to deliver on a ceasefire. Otherwise, he's going to put his hands on the button and press the button marked sanctions. Well, then there'll be no way to argue or delay very much further once this deal is signed. And at the same time, just in the last 24 hours, there is the Kremlin saying the hope that we're going to get to a deal quickly, that's a little bit over-optimistic. Trump's got a test coming up.
Yes, and when we think about the 100 days, it's quite clear that Donald Trump would have liked this to all be neatly solved before the 100 mark. So can he do it within the next 100 days? And then I think when, we also heard Susie Wiles, the chief of staff, giving this interview and saying, well, if Trump can't deliver peace in Ukraine, perhaps no one can. So you do have, and it echoes, I think, some comments by Rubio.
Was that Susie Wiles today?
Yep. Overnight. Right. And I think that it echoes comments by Rubio and others where they're saying, a bit almost, you have some time to do this, Russia and Ukraine, Europe as well as a helpful partner, but there is going to come a point when we lose patience. And I think the question is, how committed is Donald Trump getting this deal across the line? Yeah. If you get the minerals deal, it does feel like a significant stepping stone towards an overall agreement.
Yes.
For Ukraine, I think to get a minerals deal and then have America say, actually, guys, this is going to work, that would probably be a pretty terrible situation.
Yeah, I think if I was in Kyiv, I'd be a little bit worried about the comment from Susie Wiles there. You can read it different ways, but it sounded as if, look, do a deal, we want to see a deal. Equally, look, maybe there won't be a deal, and nobody else could have done any better. Again, you've got at least half the president's mind going by that indication, the president's mind, at least half, on walking away and saying, look, I did all I could, it's not my fault.
That's right. And when I spoke to the White House about this last week, they were pointing out that this is sort of a clear negotiating tactic to say that they don't want it to be thought that they are actually going to walk away, but they need to have the leverage of seeming believable.
Is thought that,
right?
That impression does exist now.
The impression does exist, and again, I do think that it would be failing to execute on a major promise that he made if Trump were to completely walk away and just sort of leave them to it. And in addition to the incredible consequences that it would, of course, have for the conflict if America were actually to abandon any kind of support for Ukraine.
The administration, guys, has got a big focus on normalizing relationships with Russia. It's almost as if that is the desirable end to all of this. The president no doubt wants to end the war. Totally, let's give him that. And maybe he'd like a Nobel Peace Prize into the bargain. Obama got one. He'd quite like one of those things on the shelf, on that golden-laden shelf as well. But deals with Russia. Now that's where he wants to go, way ahead of Europe and the rest of the world if necessary. And that, again, concerns leaders in Europe, including the British Prime Minister, surely, in a way they're not going to say out loud.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the countries where Donald Trump's team have been paying a lot of attention, so Saudi Arabia, Russia, Europe can feel a bit as though it is the bit player or the backwater at the moment when it comes to the focus.
Yeah. All right, I've got to leave it there because time has run out. Looking forward to resuming the conversation tomorrow when we will be, 2 days into the second 100 days and plenty more to talk about whoever knows what, because when you sit here, when you do this story, you never know what's coming tomorrow. Molly Ball, lovely to see you, Molly. Let's talk again soon. Katie, great to have you here and to have you staying with us, because I think you are going to make sure that you do, whether you like that or not. Emily Lee, he was our producer, and Ollie Cole. Our technical operators, James Larvin and Isaac Marley. As I say, back here tomorrow from Washington, D.C. And coming up next, Kate Borsey. This is Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
Thanks, John, from Washington, D.C. It is 7 o'clock. It's Kate Borsay and the Evening Edition coming up.
That's Biden. That's not Trump, because we came in on January, this is quarterly numbers, and we came in and I was very against everything that Biden was doing in terms of the economy, destroying our country.
Donald Trump is blaming the economic downturn in the United States on Joe Biden. We'll get expert analysis to see if he's right. The latest on the imminent minerals deal as well. We'll look at that between Ukraine and the United States. Plus, we'll take a sneak peek inside